So welcome back to Montreal for those of you that have been gone for the last 25 years. Welcome to all the Montrealers that we don't get to see. I'm Harold, in case you don't recognize me. I put on a whole bunch of weight and lost a lot of hair, and there's a bit more gray in it. But I feel comfortable now in this room because there's a lot of others that have done the same thing. So welcome to the talk that we have. It's really exciting to see what some of the people that have gone on to do. There's a lot of thanks to do, and so I'm going to start with that so that we don't forget to do that. Orly's somewhere in the room. She's on our scientific committee as well. Thank you, Orly, wherever you are. I didn't see you exactly, but she's somewhere here. Thank you to the people at the alumni office who have helped herd cats the way they did with trying to get us to actually concentrate on making this weekend something special for you. We do have a lot of different activities. There's the walk up the mountain, there's the chocolate that Christine said was very successful and excellent, and so if she says it, you know it's true. So there's a whole bunch of activities, and of course the main event is the dinner tonight, and so we expect to see you all there. This is an accredited event, and so the McGill Faculty of Medicine has accredited it, so everybody can get 3 credits. We will be sending them to you later, so please do sign in at the front desk. They also have donation cards for the class gift that we're going to tell you about more tonight, and so if you haven't donated, the challenge for the class was to give $100 per year from our graduation. So that's $2,500. So that's what we've suggested, and hopefully a lot of people have already answered that. And tonight we're going to let you know where we're at with that. We do have a couple of different class projects that are already planned. One of which is going to be a fellowship or a bursary to a deserving student, and so we'll tell you more about that tonight. Today it's about a little bit more about science and what some of our classmates have managed to do. Lawrence is with me and will also introduce the Dean, who's going to give us a little overview of a few things here in Montreal, and then introduce the Dean, and then we'll get started. So hopefully you'll have a great morning. Don't forget your evaluations, and bathrooms are somewhere out one of the doors. It's round, so you'll eventually get to them.
Okay, thanks again to everybody for coming. I had to see one of our colleagues for an injury recently. I saw him and I said, you know, I'm getting all these funny emails from you. I look at the people on the planning committee and they all make sense except for you. I don't seem to recall you being very involved as a medical student. So the 2 moderators and scientific chairs today are me and Harold only. I was never good enough to get out of Montreal, so I'm stuck at the Jewish General Hospital where I run the cardiac program. And Harold, interestingly, his picture was plastered all over the elevators at the Jewish General Hospital for the past couple of months because he ran the Canadian Lymphoma meeting, and he is the chief of the hematology department at the CHIM, at the Nouveau CHIM. So I just thought we'd talk about a little bit of changes, just the physical changes, and I'm going to start with a slide that I do for all my strategic planning meetings. This is from a night at the museum. The video apparently isn't playing, but hopefully the sound will. Hopefully the sound will.
Hey!
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 What's going on over here?
We expand or we die! Hey!
So you know, these Roman centurions are stuck in this little glass booth, and they're trying to break out. And so this is my theme whenever I talk about strategic planning. We expand or we die. So what has McGill done in the past 25 years? So on the left, we have the building that we learned in, and on the right, we have the building that we sit in right now. So we have new, slightly gold-colored aluminum cladding outside, but we also have new curricula. So we were in the old curriculum. Then shortly after, they brought in the new curriculum. And then they brought in the new curriculum with the moniker, Think Dangerously. And now they've actually gone to the really, really new curriculum. So while the exterior of the building looks the same, there are significant changes inside. They got rid of most of the library because we don't use books anymore. And they've created a whole bunch of learning labs where a lot of learning is done in an interactive and case-based manner. Other big change, of course, is the fusion of 4 great institutions. We have the Royal Vic, the Montreal Children's, the Shriners, the Montreal Chest Hospital, and that a couple years ago became the Glen campus, which a number of you may have gone on a tour already, and some of you will be going later today. It really is a spectacular and gigantic hospital where they have integrated all these different components. Anybody know what hospital this is? I heard the Vic, I heard Lachine. Anybody else? That's the Jewish General Hospital, actually. In fact, all those 3 shots are the Jewish General Hospital. You wouldn't intuitively think that this is the Jewish General Hospital, but this is the convent that was adjacent to the Jewish General Hospital, which was purchased, as well as the land to construct Pavilion K, which is our critical care pavilion. And just to show the difference from an overhead shot, what's outlined in white was the Jewish General Hospital when we started medical school, except we also have the first 2 floors of the Lady Davis Institute over here, and the rest is what the Jewish General Hospital is right now. So now we're going to go on to our program, and the first aspect of the program is to introduce Dean Eidelman. David Eidelman is a McGill graduate, native Montrealer. He's served as the Vice Principal Health Affairs. He's served as Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of Faculty of Medicine at McGill University since 2012. Before his appointment as the Dean, he was the Chair of the Department of Medicine, which is the largest department in McGill University, Physician Chief of the MUHC for 7 years. As the chair, he was responsible for overseeing the largest clinical department, as I said, which includes MUHC, the Jewish General Hospital, St. Mary's, the Douglas, and other partners. He was elected as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in 2015, and he's an accomplished clinician scientist. His research in inflammatory disorders of the airways is based at Meekins Christie. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Centre Intégré Universitaire de Santé des Services Sociaux de Centre-Ouest de l'Île. What that means is the integrated healthcare network of which the Jewish General Hospital is the main hospital center. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Eidelman on a number of highly successful committees. And we share the fierce and dedication to our institutions and the principles at which they stand, but we're completely opposite in that one of us is an idealistic realist, and the other one is a realistic idealist. Welcome, Dean Eidelman.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I love the way you left it as an exercise to the reader as to who is who. To the class of 92, congratulations on making it to the 25th anniversary of your class. It's a very big milestone. I remember being in this room for our class lecture, which in those days was on a Friday, actually. They weren't on Saturdays. But they also weren't accredited or nearly as good as this one. So I want to really congratulate the organizing committee, Harold Olney, who you heard from, Lawrence Rutsky, and I guess Orly Herman is also on your committee. I want to congratulate your class leader, Christine Wang, and I want to give a very warm welcome to everyone who's come from out of town. Really, as I think Lawrence showed you, although many of our physical attributes, if I could say, aren't as much change as some of us would like, there has been quite a lot of change over the last 25 years. And I'm really very proud of all the things that people like Lawrence and others have accomplished here. I think one of the things that's very different than when I was a medical student here, I graduated in 1979, is that we have 2 speakers, one's from the Shum, one's from the Jewish, both of whom are graduates of the same class. And when I went to school here, none of our, or very few of our classmates ever even knew where Hôpital Notre Dame was, let alone would be on staff at the Shum. You have a very distinguished class, and you're going to hear from a number of the members of that class in terms of their accomplishments. We just got the lead-off speaker, Sister Monique, who's come here all the way from São Paulo in Brazil. Was the recipient yesterday of the McGill Medicine Alumni Award for her extraordinary work that you're going to hear about shortly. And she's just one of the many, many accomplished people. I was asked to give a brief update on what's going on besides the construction projects. Well, first of all, the new curriculum that Lawrence alluded to, because yours was the new curriculum compared to my curriculum, right? So the nth integration is McGill. I don't know, for those of you who are involved in medical education, you know there's been a big move across North America to shift medical education away from a traditional two-part thing, the sort of Flexner report idea of basic science followed by clinical work, to the point where there's much more integration between clinical work and basic science, and this has taken place here as well with early introduction to clinical milieu, with students in first year spending time with family doctors. With the big shift towards generalism in medicine, we've also moved towards emphasizing family medicine as a sort of the base of medicine, and all of our first 18-month courses are really oriented around that, which is not unique, but we feel we do it in a unique and very, very excellent way. I have to say that although we've had our bumps in the road, as you no doubt know about with our accreditation status, I now have the privilege of having dinner with all the medical students in first year, in batches, of course. Not all 185 come over to my house for dinner. But what's really cool that I've told several people is I think the students feel very, very excited about their program because of its variety, because of the clinical exposure, and because of the much better integration between basic science and clinical work than existed, at least in my version of the curriculum. I know it was better in your time. You heard about the different hospitals. We also have a very, very well-known and very successful stimulation center, which has expanded dramatically thanks to a generous gift by the Steinberg family, late Arnold Steinberg, our former chancellor. We've launched a new school of population and global health. One thing that you should know is your class's gift, the class of '92 anyway, your reunion class gift, which supports resilience, has really been put to work in a unit that we now call WELL, which I forget what it stands for, but it's essentially a unit which provides support for students, and in fact supports for students across the health professions, from medicine, undergrad, postgrad, nursing, PNOT, and dentistry. And this has become a very core element in medical education generally and in education. And we happen to have a particularly strong one, and we thank you for your support. We've had a lot of research success, particularly in neuroscience. We had a very large grant from the federal government, which was backed also by the provincial government and private industry, called Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives. Some of you may have seen, if you read Nature or Science, you have seen that the Montreal Neurological Institute is declared itself the first open science institute, and actually McGill is, thanks to the work of Dr. Guy Rouleau and his team, is really a world leader in terms of doing that, and it's really setting the agenda, at least in Canada, but also, I believe, also in the United States, but in Canada, in terms of figuring out where open science fits in versus traditional patent-oriented discovery, where it fits in the world. We have a wonderful new interdisciplinary initiative in immunity and infection, which is we nicknamed MI4, which is going to be help bring together all of the great strengths we have in those areas at McGill. And McGill is really doing extremely well in computational medicine. We have the largest sequencing center in Canada. We have a variety of other very big strengths in artificial intelligence, neuroinformatics, and other areas that we're very, very proud of. You may be aware that this medical school was founded in 1821, and with its founding as kind of a proprietary medical school, associated with the then founded Montreal General Hospital, McGill University came to life. And so we'll be celebrating the university's bicentennial in 2021, which is very soon. Of course, really, it's only our bicentennial, but I let the rest of the university think it's everybody's. And we're going to have some really cool things to talk about then. So without any further ado, I'm just going to thank you very much for your time and wish you a great rest of homecoming. Have a great day.
Okay, so we're just a little late, which is perfect. We expect it to be later than this, and so we're glad. I'm very pleased to introduce Monique, who the dean has already taken away all the information that I had ready for her. So Monique, as you know, left us for Brazil shortly after graduating. She's still with the Congregación de Santa Marcelina, and has set up and deployed an enormous network in Sao Paulo. And we're super pleased that she's come back. As you heard, she just won the humanitarian prize and doing us all proud. Monique.
Is that okay? So thank you so much. This is very special to be here at this side of the amphitheater 25 years later. So I think because this is the CME, disclosure slide, I have no relationship with any commercial company or no conflict of interest. And I just thought putting up a picture, we do look a little bit different. So what I'll try to do, it's going to be hard to give you what had happened over the last 23 years that I've been in Sao Paulo, but I will try to concentrate on a little bit the Brazilian system and the family program, which is what I've been mostly involved. Although Brazil has offered me a lot of different opportunities, either in the medical hospital field and the primary healthcare field. Brazil, I'm not going to go over a lot of the qualities and the celebrities that they have, like soccer, right? We have big soccer programs and carnival, which is very important. We have this Festa Junina, which is the St. John's feast. This is me on top here. Everybody gets disguised, and we all have celebration of weddings in June. And not to talk about the politics right now that are going on. Probably our ex-president is going to go to jail sometime. But anyway, every day it's a new corruption scandal that's being discovered, which is making it very difficult on politics and the politics of the public system. But one thing probably Brazil is not very known is that it has one of the biggest public system in the world, where of the 200 million people of the population, more than 160 million should be covered totally with this program. About 40% of the population has insurance, so it complicates it a little bit because you have a two-speed system, and a lot of them, they both work inside some of the hospital like ours, which is a philanthropic hospital. But it has done, for example, last year, 25,000 transplants, and it has more than 343,000 public bed hospital. It has 11 million admissions a year and 2.9 million births a year. So lots of challenges with the system, but just to give you an over perspective about where I actually work. So this is Brazil, biggest country in Latin America. This is the population of the state of Sao Paulo, and this is the city of Sao Paulo. It looks like a dog's head, but the nose of the dog, these are 2 ears. I stay in this part, which is the east part of the city. And actually right now, for the last 11 years, along with working on the primary health care, I'm the medical director of this teaching hospital, which is a 739 hospital bed. It's got almost 4,300 employees. It's a tertiary care hospital, so it's the only hospital for 2.5 million that does transplant, neurosurgery, cardiac surgery. So you can see it's a pretty busy hospital. We do 2,500 admissions a month. And more than 30,000 ambulatory consultations a month too. 350 births. And we have 42 medical residency programs, of which composing about 400 residents, and 3 multi-professional residency programs, which are new and they're very interesting. It's a 2-year program for hematology oncology, primary healthcare, and emergency, where we have pharmacists, nursing, physiotherapists, social workers that do their residency together. We have 200 clerks, and 84% of that hospital is public, which means that 1 floor is a private hospital, is a private floor, which gives a lot of ethical decisions throughout the day, every day. Empty ICU beds with 10 patients from the public side needing that assistance. And these are like I was telling you, Brazil gave me a lot of different opportunities. In 1998, the government of São Paulo made this new law which made philanthropic hospital being able to manage smaller hospitals and give the management to these hospitals. So in 1998, I was very young then, I became medical director of this hospital, which was brand new. So I had the opportunity to start a hospital from scratch. And that gave me the opportunity to change obstetrical care. I don't know if you know, but Brazil is champion in cesarean section rates in the world. On the public side, it's probably 50%, but private side, it's close to 90%. And when I got to Brazil, episiotomy rate were 100%. So that was a shocking experience. And fortunately, I got people that were really family medicine residents or family medicine doctors don't do obstetrics care in the hospital. So it was only gynecology obstetricians. But I was able to convince some of good partners, and we were able to change the way obstetrical care was given. And starting a new hospital, we were able to do labor room and have the family come in and diminish the episiotomy care, the episiotomy rate. So this was a great work. But what I really want to share with you is this family healthcare program, which is a passion of mine. I say that I came to Brazil at the right time and at the right place. In 1994 was the national healthcare program development in Brazil, which is territory-based, and it's based on community healthcare agents. And these agents have to live in within their 200 families that they take care of, and I'll show you in a little bit. But in 1996, at the time, the Ministry of Health said, well, because the program was starting at the northeast part of the country, and he said, well, if São Paulo starts the program and it works, then the rest of Brazil is going to adopt it. So he came and talked to the sisters, which we were already a big teaching hospital at the time, and recognized for public work. He offered the sisters to start this program in São Paulo. And that's what we did. 2017 in 9 units that we started in 3 months. Trained all the healthcare agents, got to choose physicians that wanted to do this work. Until then, the healthcare units only had gynecologists, pediatricians, and internal medicine specialists. No physicians that really did the primary care as such. So that revolution is having per team 1 family doctor, 1 nurse, 2 nursing assistants, and 5 community health agents. And then starting in 1998, we also had the buccal or dental team as well, with 1 dental surgeon, 1 assistant, and a dental hygiene consultant. What the real revolution is that because the system until then was really disease-oriented, this program helped it to focus on health, to give a continuous offer for family, territory-based, to do active search, so the community healthcare agents go house to house to see how the family's going and orient and educate. We do promotion and preventive and curative character. We try to be resolutive, and we have a lower cost and higher satisfaction for the population. So this would be, as you can see, very dense population. And in our part of the city, some of the regions are 17,000 people per kilometer squared, per square kilometer. So very, very dense population. And this would be sort of a team, which would have 4 or 5 different regions. In each of those regions, the healthcare region, it lives in one of those families and sees the families over the whole month, visits them monthly. And we have some priorities, so which would be pregnancy, diabetes patients, hypertensive patients, and children under 2. So those priorities, the community healthcare agent has to see every month. The other families, he should see them every month, but sometimes because of other activities, he's not able to. And so the program was really well accepted by the population, and the program just grown over the country over the years. So 1998, small coverage, 2010, and now we have 41,000 teams all over Brazil, which is covering more than 60% of the population. And we have more than 240 or almost 250,000 community healthcare agents. We've been able to work with these community agents, and now we're trying to informatize their work, because until then it's all paperwork and it's all manual. And so we've developed a small program where you can see this would be the nurse that accompanies the healthcare agent, and she would see how many families have been visited. So the red one are the ones that have not been visited yet, and the blue ones are the ones who are. The gray ones are houses that are empty or moved. The patient is moved. And these are the priorities that are inside the houses. So we'd collect all that information. We now have 200 teams who are under the management of the Santa Marceline, and 1,000 community healthcare agents. Sorry. So this is a little bit what we have as information about the waste, the sewage system, if they have filtrated water or not, and the way the houses are constructed. How we accompany all the pregnant ladies, if the prenatal care, hypertensive, tuberculosis, and just some data we're trying to collect and see. We have a lot of potential. The problem is we do a lot of assistance, and we have few people that are staying behind and trying to compose and manage better our data. So if somebody wants to come and help. We have a lot of potential. The community healthcare agents have or like a vigilance, a continuing vigilance, and I think this is the great great treasure of this program, and the potential for it, because we can accompany all the time all the population that's territory based. So that's the coverage of the population that we cover, that we accompany. So 90% of diabetes are controlled, are hypertensive patient. We have a lot of potential of doing better, but we're working on it. And these are the consultation and home visits. So it's been a real success. We have more than 100 million or 120 million Brazilian covered. The infant mortality, which was 20 years ago more than 60 per thousand, and now it's down to 14 per thousand over the last 20 years. So it's big success. We've been reported by the Lancet and BMJ. Some people have done some studies. We're lacking better studies, but it shows that this is at the beginning of the public healthcare system, and we've done a lot of work with the diminishing of infant mortality by the regions. It's still a lot of socioeconomic differences, but we've done a lot to do to diminish it. And then we're working on the potentially avoidable hospital admissions for chronic disease. So we've done some work to do that. We're lacking better studies, but Masinko in 2006 says for every 10% increase in the population covered by the family health care strategy, infant mortality diminishes 4.6%. And we have a big population that really enjoys having the same professional and the same nurse and the same community health care agent accompanying him. Along with the family health care program, we've developed other units with the government to be able to take account all the needs of the population. So we have psychosocial centers, traditional healthcare units for the population that's not covered with the family healthcare units. We have dental healthcare clinics with specialties, rehabilitation clinic, and walk-in clinics. And we're trying to work as, organizing a network to be able to accompany the patient wherever he goes. And so this is a network for urgencies and emergencies. And this is my favorite. It's for the pregnancy care. We accompany the mothers and the well baby care after. And the babies that get 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, we do graduation. So, and this is a big celebration. We've had 2,000 babies graduating last year, and it's always a big success. We do a lot of mental health care work too, fighting to diminish preconceptions and to work. We've worked on environment health as well for Hour of the Planet and trying to diminish pollution. This is our numbers from January to July of 2007, so number of consultations, the people that have been attended, the community health agent home visits. So big numbers. And just to finish, then what I've been doing, and I think what I've been privileged of working in is at the society to be able to help the society become a real specialist society. Family medicine was not very recognized. It's still very difficult. There are 400,000 physicians in Brazil, of which very few are family physicians. I worked at the society in 2001 to revive it, and we were able to be recognized as a specialty in 2004. And Sarah Turcotte, which is another Canadian family physician who was at Brazil at the time, and myself were recognized as the two first family physicians in Brazil because we had a Canadian title. And then we were able to help the society title all the other ones that had expertise and had been working a long time. And we put up the first title exam for the society. Since then, there's been 14 exams, and there's now 4,000 physicians that work as a family physician titled. Still very little for the 41,000 teams that exist, but the society has been working to do, it's finished, 2 minutes, to go over the whole country to be able to do congresses and help the specialty to be stronger. There are books that have been written. We've translated the Yin Maikwepne, so Canada is very, very well seen in Brazil and talked about. We have a lot of challenges. The one we say, it's a saying that we have to change the wheel as the car is going, because we have all these teams and we don't have the people that are specialized enough to work in those teams. But I think one of the things Santa Medicine has done is we've been able to bring a brand new Bachelor in Medicine. So 2012, we got our first cohort of medical students, and I'm really proud to say that McGill has helped. Miriam Bola and Dr. Cruz had come to Brazil and help us to write a curriculum and try to see. We have a 2 entry per year, about 100 students a year. And we'll have our first graduates in 2018, next year. So if somebody wants to come to our graduation, it's going to be a very special moment. We've written some books. These are the students in residence. I was going to talk about soccer, but okay. I played soccer until last year. And just to finish off and to see if anybody wants to work, we've been involved as well with Africa. It's a Canada, Brazil, African missionary work. We've done 10 missions so far. So if anybody's interested in helping, it's in Benin, French-speaking country. But it's been very great, gratifying to work. So I hope I was able to give you a little bit of what's been happening in those 23 years. A lot more to say, but if anybody wants to come and visit, Brazil is open. Thank you. Oh, questions?
No, there's supposed to be 4 microphones.
That was incredible. In Canada, we don't have door-to-door family medicine people appearing to check on my health. And I was wondering how you're handling Zika virus in the face of all this.
Okay, the mosquito Aedes aegypti has dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, which are the three diseases. It's a prevention by looking at the environment. We have a lot of problems because of different politics that go on. So depending on the government and the way he invests on prevention, we diminish or augment. In São Paulo itself, Zika is not very present. We have a lot more problem with dengue fever and hemorrhagic dengue. We have big problems. But this is not right now the season. But when the season comes in January, February, March, we have a lot of patients admitted, unfortunately. But we do try to do the prevention, and with the community healthcare agents, they help a lot because they go visit house to house and educate the people and tell them not to have standing water and to work. But we have a lot of problem with the waste and tires, and so.
There's another question.
I have a question. At what level, how should I word this? Birth control, how is that handled by your clinical health teams?
Okay, so the public clinic, abortion in Brazil is against the law. There's only 2 situations where it's legal, which would be rape or malformation right now for anencephaly. So birth control is done in the clinic, but it's a very complicated social problem. I would say we have 20% teenagers who are pregnant, and some of them know how to prevent being pregnant, but sometimes they want to be pregnant. At 14 and 15 years old, sometimes it gives them the social status different, and it helps them to get away from their families. So it's very complicated.
But it is offered, the various forms.
Yeah. Being a religious congregation, we work with the government, and the government offers the system, and our teams explores all the options. Is that? Yeah.
One last question.
Excuse me, there's one over there too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Monique. That was an awesome and inspiring presentation. So I just wanted to clarify the chronology. So 1998, when you were medical director, this vision of family health teams, of this outreach, that originated initially with your vision, your hospital, and then it eventually spread out through the entire Brazil. Can I give you the full credit for changing Brazil?
No.
Or
No, but I always had a foot in the hospital and a foot in the primary health care. I always did the two at the same time. So in the morning, I'd organize the hospital, and in the afternoon, I'd work at the clinic. The program existed. I actually came in '94 when the program started. I was just, I think, the propulsor of it, having started it in Sao Paulo, and then and having done it in a way that it was pretty founded, and being a family physician from McGill and from Canada gave me a lot of credit to be able to do that.
well, congratulations.
Yeah. I just want to, I forgot, we're now having a partnership after 20 years of coming and going a lot. We've officially started a partnership for preceptors in family medicine. Dr. Howard Bergman and Dr. Dina Edelman came last year to visit. It was a great visit, and we finally signed a contract to on e-line learning for 35 preceptor. It actually started 2 days ago, so very happy to have a bit of McGill in Sao Paulo.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Ludeman. He's a clinical professor of otolaryngology at UBC Children's Hospital. He's a clinical researcher who specializes in research related to ENT surgery in children. He has a special interest in promoting choking prevention, which examines causes of choking, including foreign body aspiration and caustic ingestion, which some of our classmates could listen to him last night. And he offers education to caregivers and healthcare professionals, and he's going to be talking to us about his global choking prevention strategy.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Well, I'm delighted and quite honored to be here to talk amongst so many friends, colleagues, classmates. Thank you. This is my disclosure slide, and I guess the point I'd like to make is that we did receive a few donations, but they're about 10 years ago towards this project. So, and then I would like to give a lot of credit to all the people who have helped in the various teams. I'll start off with a bit of history. Chevalier Jackson is really well known to pediatric otolaryngologists. He's really kind of our hero and our father. He reduced the mortality of upper aerodigestive foreign bodies from 98 to 2%. And this was largely with what we would consider fairly primitive anesthesia. And he developed his own bronchoscopes, esophagoscopes, techniques, and so forth, and taught distal illumination to the world. He lobbied the US Congress for decades to enact the Federal Caustic Act. That was the skull and crossbones that you see in the States on poisons. And met quite a lot of resistance from lobbyists. People who made lye and so forth didn't want any such warning labels. He was the first to attempt to teach choking prevention to North American parents, and you can see from the book Hygiena, the journal Hygiena, what does your baby put in his mouth, which is maybe not so politically correct today, but despite many efforts in prevention, however, choking, foreign body aspiration, ingestion, it continues and may be lethal. And this is a chalk drawing from Chevalier Jackson, who would draw ambidextrously, actually. And next to it is a photo from my fellowship, Director Lauren Hollinger, many decades later. We found that traditional injury prevention strategies don't work very well for choking prevention. And this is likely because of a number of factors. Many parents think that their children are gifted, and they might be gifted on their ability to chew and swallow nuts and hot dogs and things like that in their parents' minds. Often they misinterpret advice about safe feeding practices as a criticism of their parenting skills, which I and some of my colleagues have found out firsthand. Parents are, as we know, inundated with health and safety information, And choking prevention is really not terribly relevant until about 6 months of age. And swallowing physiology and patterns of choking are fairly complex. So choking remains the third or fourth leading cause of accidental death in children worldwide. In Canada, it's probably the third. And it's a persistent cause of adult and childhood morbidity and considerable healthcare costs. The first leading cause of child mortality, or accidental death, I should say, is motor vehicle accidents, followed by drowning, and death from burns and choking are about the same. So in our research, we discovered that what has really worked is when there's been direct education of parents and children by otolaryngologists and nurses and other healthcare members using multimedia exhibits to relay cases of choking and prevention strategies. And this was noted both in Israel and in Crete. However, it's very difficult to accomplish such education in person on a large scale. And thus we set out to try to do this with the use of computers, which was fairly novel back in that point of time. And we developed an initial video, which we still have as part of our website. And this was mainly directed towards preteens. And along with a preliminary website, it was studied by interviews of 10-year-olds before and after exposure to this learning materials, and it was found to be effective. Well, that brings us on to the website that we launched about 4 years ago. And this has many facets to it. This is the homepage for teenagers and, of course, for parents. And we try to keep the language fairly simple. This is just a partial list. If you go to the website, you'll be able to see much more. This is about gel candies, which, as you may know, have killed numerous children in North America. I think in a 2-year period, actually, it was 12 children in North America died from gel candies, including one girl in Toronto, and yet they're still widely available. Disc batteries are really a major problem. They can burn through the esophagus in a matter of hours and cause mortality. And these are the most common foreign bodies. And a page about extraction cases. So if you would like to show this one particular page to medical students, that seems to be what really grabs their attention. It has videos and so forth. So teaching our medical colleagues is another facet of what I've been doing, but I'm focusing here on what we're trying to educate for the parents and children in school. This deals with a difficult problem that we encounter almost on a very frequent basis in terms of diagnosis, because of course most bronchial foreign bodies are radiolucent, and so we have to look at indirect signs of their presence. And this is adapted from Chevalier Jackson's original drawing. And we have basic anatomy. Again, this is mainly developed for high school students, with the feeling that if we can teach the students in the schools before they graduate, that at least when they become parents themselves, they'll have this background information. Plus, of course, if they're babysitting, etc., it's going to be very helpful. We have a page about choking in various parts of the world and saving lives. And I'll come to the Facebook part of this in a minute, but I'll say that this year, a 5-year-old who had been taught choking prevention and life-saving techniques in England at school entry saved his 3-year-old brother. A bit about Chevalier Jackson. It's really presented in layers of information as well, so hopefully the basic information is very easy to get, but if someone's, for instance, in an IB program wants to do a project, there's plenty of information, references, and so forth to get them on their way. And we have a page on choking in the media, various stories, including actors and so forth, who have saved lives. Now, this is the one case that I did not put in the website, and that was purposefully because I didn't want to give anybody the idea of making homemade blow darts, but that was quite something. And that blow dart was made with a darting pin and blue tack and yarn and hockey tape. So you have to make sure that the force is going out, not in. So we did initial analysis of the effectiveness of the website, and I think it was 122 Vancouver students, and this was just a month after the website was launched. And again, I was working with my colleagues at UBC Education. And with pre and post test, we analyzed and found that the exposure to the website completely transformed prior perceptions of these grade 11 and 12 students for both choking hazards and choking prevention. And so we believe we have enough evidence to continue to promote this website. So it has been translated into a total of 8 languages now, including the last 2 translations provided by medical students at UBC. And above are my pediatric otolaryngology colleagues that have provided translations. I've introduced the website to China during 2 trips, one with the Bethune Society. And I was advised that I should really get into social media to try to promote this. And this was a couple years ago, and I was new to it. I didn't really know much about Facebook, and even less about Twitter. But I had heard that one of my colleagues in Saudi had given a lecture, had gone onto Twitter, and we had a huge bump in our website visits from that. And therefore, we started on Facebook and established an annual Global Choking Prevention Week. I used LinkedIn as well, and a bit of Twitter, but not for very long. And we've posted the preteen video as well. These are the current partners, including South America. So, and these are some of the early Facebook posts which I boosted to certain audiences. A few more, and a few more. So this is some preliminary data. As you notice, it starts from November 2013 when we launched the website, only into 18 months ago. But just to give you an introduction, and you can see here an initial spike, and that was, again, my colleague in Saudi using Twitter, and then with the Facebook posts, we've had more. And again, this is data up to May 2016 usage. And then this is more complete data up until just last month. So 15,000 Facebook likes of the page, post likes over 1 million. We believe we've reached over 2 million people worldwide, mostly through boosting posts, which cost a little bit of money, but I think it's well worth it. And I believe that the social media probably has helped us save lives and by preventing choking. But there's certainly more work to be done. Again, this is just a little bit of data regarding the use of Twitter. I've also established a number of contacts with LinkedIn to try to spread this. And so thus far, we're close to 40,000 website visitors and 71,000 page views. And basically in the last 16 months, the usage of the website has doubled compared to the first 30 months. So we will try to continue to distribute this, and I certainly would appreciate all of your help. We will be embarking on a larger study of high school students in BC. And what we started off with was validation of the pre and post questionnaires that we used initially via teacher candidates. Of course, long-term analysis is the truest measure of the effectiveness of this website. It's going to take a few decades probably to get an answer as to whether this website can lead to fewer operative procedures and, of course, choking fatalities. So again, why are we teaching students in school? Because we are striving for a generational impact and overcome some of the difficulties in teaching parents. So again, from Chevalier Jackson to a more modern quote, and a few more quotes. So thank you very much for your attention.
That was great. Questions from the audience? We have two up in the back. If we can bring a microphone up, please.
Hi, thank you so much. Are you seeing problems from this new method of feeding young infants called baby-led weaning?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are. Of course, so baby-led weaning is basically letting the child choose what they want to eat, and they're often presented with food in whole form rather than mushed up or blenderized and so forth. So it's extremely dangerous. I can give you a few anecdotes. Of course, in the UK, there was a Well Baby magazine that was out probably 15, 20 years ago that showed a baby teething on raw carrot. And sort of a colleague of mine, Vito Forte at Sick Kids, who's since retired, took that on and got that picture changed. Another important issue that we've addressed in the Facebook post is the fact that peanut allergy has led to, or trying to prevent peanut allergy has led to at least some choking cases. So, according to the latest research, to try to prevent peanut allergy, it's thought to put just a tiny bit of smooth peanut butter, maybe inside the cheek of a baby. But unfortunately, New York Times, BBC, all these organizations have put out these articles about this scientific study with pictures of whole nuts or even fragments of nuts. And so we've even had a grad from UBC Medical School prepare a smoothie with crunchy peanut butter for his young child, his infant, and subsequently had to go to the operating room to take out a bronchial foreign body. So I hope that answers your question, but yeah, I think it is a problem, and more people go to this type of feeding, I think the more we need to try to educate the public about the dangers.
Feel more comfortable suggesting purees for a bit longer, because
absolutely,
I really just sound like an old fogey when I do that, and it's like I don't know about this new method of feeding. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so many children are gifted in terms of chewing and swallowing, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Chevalier Jackson had a quote as well, many quotes actually, not all, that wheezes his asthma was one of them that relates to this. But the other was that if you give a child without molars a peanut, there's three things that they can do with it. They can spit it out, they can swallow it whole, or they can aspirate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, that excellent presentation. I have a question for you, a comment and a question, because I've noticed over the years in, not so much in patients actually, but in people I know, friends and family, and babysitters, almost a phobic avoidance that's happened about feeding certain foods. I remember a babysitter of ours when my kids were young was absolutely horrified that we even had grapes in the house, and hot dogs and other things. And I'm just wondering, with the current nutritional guidelines that we have, which are encouraging us to eat more fruits, more vegetables, more grains, more nuts maybe, how do we balance that in the wake of what we have, recently declared as an epidemic of childhood obesity that we're seeing? and adult obesity and diabetes, etc. So how do we balance that out so that people don't become so fearful that they're not feeding any of these good things to their kids, and yet avoiding those foods that are a choking hazard, or at least knowing how to give them?
Well, I think that's a great question. And of course, we know now that free sugars are very bad for us humans, despite what the sugar industry tried to tell us when we were young children. And of course, we want to have less fruit juices, but I think the answer is in food preparation. So grapes are absolutely fine as long as they're cut into quarter sections. Same with hot dogs. Hot dogs ideally should be sliced lengthwise, both ways, and then cut into sections. And this is really until about age 5 in order to prevent, totally obstructive glottic foreign body. And I'll also say that when I was on my first shift as a resident at the Montreal Children's, my first call was to see a child who was DOA with a hot dog in his glottis. So I've taken a personal, mission in this. And I know that a lot of parents don't really believe in that, but every once in a while you'll find, for instance, at our Little League, where my boy used to play, someone who's knowledgeable and is cutting every single hot dog lengthwise in order to prevent this. So I think the more people who have personal histories or family histories of choking that can help spread the word, that's where it's at, along with systematic education of our young people.
We're going to take one last brief question.
I thought pediatric meds were moving towards gel, some of those. And secondly, as it happens, they interviewed a man in his 60s who had aspirated a little toy. That was on the news a couple of weeks ago. And then a suggestion that you have something for seasonal candy like Halloween, Easter, Christmas, because there's a lot of candy given out then, and have some theme for those seasons.
Thank you. We have actually addressed that, and that was one of the first recommendations from Safe Start when I got first started into this. And we actually used standard media about Halloween and winter holidays and so forth. So I think that's an important point. In terms of the gel, the key is that it doesn't have konjac, which is what's the ingredient in the gel candies, which in Japan they call the lethal morsel. Those are the gels that are in a coffee creamer size container. You take off the top and you're supposed to pop it back, and they're actually probably the most lethal man-made choking hazard on the planet. I won't go into some of the dirty politics and so forth of the companies that made those, but we really need to increase public education about those and disc batteries. Thank you.
Okay, we're doing great on time, and thanks for these questions. They're great, and we'll try to continue to the same pace. So I have the pleasure of introducing Georges Sylvestre, who all of you remember did OBGYN here at McGill, and then went on to do a fellowship at Albert Einstein College in maternal fetal medicine. He did a couple of years working in the Bronx and Queens before finally going back to Wales and joining the staff there at Cornell. His interest has been in perinatal epidemiology, and he's on steering committees, some large international studies. Today he's going to give us a different talk that some people have heard about, and we recruited him specifically to do that on LGBT competent care. Georges?
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here and find myself in the seats where I was 25 years ago. Quite a few pounds ago, quite a few years ago. So this talk came about can you hear me well? Because I'm not going to use the standing microphone. But a few years back when Caitlyn Jenner did her big outing, my CEO, and it's a small hospital in Queens where we worked, and certainly not a hospital where a lot of LGBT people would go primarily. And he said, you know, Caitlyn Jenner, that's really interesting. We should have a policy on transgender in our hospital. And Flushing Hospital was certainly not a place where transgender would go primarily. So I said, well, Bruce, we don't have a policy on LGB, which is really 99 point something % of all the LGBTs. I mean, in terms of visitation rights, in terms of spousal access, in terms of are we friendly, LGBT friendly? And actually we were not, really. In terms of intake forms, we had basically husband and wife, as the first questions instead of, person, patient, and spouse or, partner. So I thought it was important to address this. So although I certainly have a bias in this topic, being an LGBT gay physician myself, I have no financial conflict of interest, unfortunately. So I'm going to go through a couple of terms in terms of LGBTQA. The letters keep increasing every year. Demographics, the terminology, some sociological background, stigmatization and marginalization, look at a few health outcomes and means to address the problem. So it's not a big surprise. We are about between 1% and 4% of the population in the States, and very similar in Canada as well, of people identified gay, lesbian, or bisexual. About 3 or 4% of people admit to have had some same-sex sexual contact in the last year. And I think it's very important to know that these studies very often don't define what is sexual contact. Is it a look on a porn website? Is it touching somebody? Is it kissing a person of the same sex? So it's not very well defined. In terms of same-sex sexual contact ever, one study which is a bit better structured, published in the 90s, listed as much as 11.2% of women have had the same-sex contact once in their life at least, and up to 9% of men. And in the USA, it's estimated that 3 million same-sex people live in same-sex relationships, and more than 1 million children are being raised by LGBT couples and individuals. Again, broad definition, because a lot of these kids are born out of heterosexual marriages, and subsequently one of the parents or both of them come out. So these children technically are raised by LGBT individuals. And importantly, LGBTs, we are diverse with respect to age, race. There are gays everywhere. We all speak different languages. In every countries, we have different incomes, socioeconomic status. In terms of political views, in the States where I live now, I think it's pretty much difficult to say if we have divergent political views, because we're fairly much, leaning towards one certain party and not the other. I will say no more. Same-sex couples live everywhere, every single county in the US, clustered around the coasts. And I was not able to find exactly the same data in Canada, but it's similar, in fact. There's a little more same-sex people that live in BC and in Quebec and Ontario, a little less in the Maritimes of Winnipeg and these places in the Midwest, but everywhere. Canada is a very, I don't want to use the word tolerant, because tolerant implies there's doing something wrong. But Canada is an open place for an LGBT person. We've seen it in terms of marriage acceptance. It came way before the States. So I came to get married here with my husband, David, just a couple blocks away at the faculty club. I wanted to get married in New York because I'd been in New York for a decade by then. My husband is American, but it was illegal for gay people to get married in New York. So I came to Canada, where I had a wonderful time at McGill. So let's go through a couple of LGBTQA concepts. So biological sex, it's funny because whenever I do ultrasound in maternal fetal medicine, we used to say, oh, does she know the gender? Well, it's not gender, it's sex, because gender and sex are different things. Biological sex is the sex that you're born with as a male or female. Gender identity is the sex that you associate with. It's not necessarily the sex you're born with, but you might be a woman trapped in a man's body, which is a term sometimes we use, or vice versa. Gender expression is something different too. And sexual orientation is a physical and emotional attraction to another person, being the same sex or not, or both, or not sexually attracted to anybody at all, asexual, which happens sometimes. Sexual orientation can be subdivided into more terms as well, sexual behavior. Depending on what you want to look at, what you want to research, sometimes you're going to find and look for data about, sexual orientation, the way you feel as a gay or straight person, but not necessarily sexual behavior. So there are some people who say they're straight men, for example, but have sex with men. So that's why the term MSM is often used in epidemiology, men who have sex with men, because if you ask them in a questionnaire, they won't say they're gay, but if you ask them a little further, do you have sex with men? Oh yeah, sure, all the time, or once in a while, or every now and then, but I'm straight. So if you look at data like STI or HIV transmission in MSMs, you have to look at behavior and not necessarily identity. Identity, you might very well have a person who's like a 12 or 13-year-old kid who says, I'm gay, I never had sex with anybody of the same sex or the other sex, but I feel gay, and that's fine too. If you look at data such as psychological outcomes and demographics, that's important. Instead of looking at behavior, look at identity. And then you have the issue of desire attraction. Are you attracted in general to people of the same sex? Maybe you're a straight man or a straight woman, but you have strong desires toward the other sex, but never acted on it. And that's going to cause problems as well. So yes, discordance between self-reported self-reported identity and behavior is important, because if you look at some data, there was a study published in 2006 looking at men in New York City, a study from the Department of Health. So obviously you look at a biased sample with men with some mental health issues. And, of all the men who identify as straight in the questionnaire, there's 9% that admit to have had sex with men in the prior year. And importantly, those men were more likely to be in a minority ethnic group, a racial group, low socioeconomic status, and be foreign born. But importantly, they're less likely to have used a condom in the last year in their sex. So obviously that's going to have big impacts on HIV transmission, STD transmission. And also, if you look at lesbian population, up to 80–90% of lesbians have had in their lives sex with one man or many men in the past. So don't assume that if the patient says she's a lesbian, well, I don't need to address birth control because she's a lesbian, or I don't need to do a pap smear. And I've heard that before as a gynecologist, like, oh, lesbians don't have HPV. Because that's why we don't do pap smears in our practice. Well, that's wrong, because most lesbians have had sex with men before, and HPV may be present in the lesbian population as well. And 8% of the self-reported lesbian have had sex with a man in the last year. So more terms, transgender, we try not to treat transsexual anymore, okay? These are people whose gender identity or expression is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Transitioning is a term used for the transition from one sex to the other, okay? And intersex is a person whose biological sex is ambiguous at birth. That's, is very rare. It does happen. Some kids are born with uterus or testes or ovaries at the same time, but that's so incredibly rare. And to complicate things matters even more, in 2013, there was a study of over 400 transgender adults in Massachusetts, and 40% of these people said they're neither man or woman, they're non-binary. So that's why you'll use terms like he or she, but sometimes they refer to them as they. They is a third pronoun used for a non-binary person. I will not take too much time on this, but these are the meaning of every color in the pride flag, the diversity, going from sexuality, life, sunlight, nature, and spirit, in case you didn't know. So disparities in health outcome for the LGBT population. So yes, there are disparities, and we're not doing as good as a job as we could. There's a long history of bias in healthcare, going both ways, from physicians and from patients as well, from the general population. In the 80s and 90s, some studies came out, looking at physicians, surveying physicians, and in 1982, almost 40% of physicians were, quote, uncomfortable providing care to gay patients, male or female. And in 1999, this came down to, but still 19% is an incredible number of physicians who are uncomfortable caring for gay patients. And looking at the general population is the same thing, actually, even more shocking. 30% of people surveyed would change physician if they found out that their physician were gay. They would be uncomfortable, and 35% would change practice if they found out that some gays work there. So sometimes I forget that I've never lived anywhere else in the States than New York City. I live in the bubble of New York City, which is extremely diverse and extremely open, so I never had any problems being a gay physician there or caring for gay patients, obviously. But still, in my community, some of my gay friends have had some setbacks, some discussion with their own providers. So the American Association of Physicians with Human Rights, I've got to tell you about this because that's funny. In the 80s, when I was sitting right here as a young gay medical student, I heard of this association, American Association of Physicians for Human Rights, and that was what's called the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, a group of gay physicians. But in the 80s, we couldn't call ourselves Gay and Lesbian Physician Association because, we could be targeted with hate mail. It's a nonprofit. And hate responses. I didn't even know there were gay physicians out there, but that was the name of the group then. So the gay physicians were sent a survey, over 700, with 63% were males, 37 female, and 18% respondents from the South. And 78% of physicians surveyed, gay physicians, said they had a practice which was mostly straight. And obviously, the majority of physicians have heard of some anti-gay bias towards patients, that they witnessed themselves, and they have observed that some gay patients got substandard care just because they were gay. And at least, I think it's closer to 100%, we heard some colleagues making remarks about gay patients. It can be as subtle as the resident. It's happened to me. A resident would come to me like, oh, the patient in room 6 is gay. Like, okay, fine, And she has sex with women. I'm like, okay, that's fine. It's not negative, but it's like, oh, so special. Like, there's nothing special about it, really. So I'm quite out at work, so they call me, even I heard, oh yeah, he's the gynecologist. Because, okay, I'm a gay gynecologist. I don't do gynecology, I do mostly obstetrics, but call me the gynecologist if it makes you happy. So this guy ran for office, this is less than 10 years ago in New York State as a governor. Thankfully he lost, but he said on TV, I don't want my children to run in gay pride. I'm not going to walk in gay pride. My opponent runs in gay pride, but I don't want my kids to be brainwashed, saying that gay behavior is normal. Thankfully, he lost, not surprising, it was New York, but it's pretty outrageous that you hear a comment like this. So, I had to look at the word stigma and what it came from, because I'm going to talk about stigmatization and marginalization. Stigma means something which is abnormal, which is different, which is perceived negatively. So gay behavior, being gay is stigmatized, in a lot of societies. Again, I live in New York City, but if you grew up in places like in the Middle East, South America, in South Asia, it's not so cool to be gay. Really, it's not. You can be stigmatized, marginalized, rejected from your family, from your church, from your work, from your, you can go to jail, you can get killed in some countries. So to become stigmatized is not a good thing. It doesn't create a good sense of feeling of self. It leads to stress, anxiety, depression, and ultimately on the top of this, the government tells you that no, we will not give same-sex spouses any benefits. No, we'll not hire you because you're gay. So imagine how you feel. So this is a kid, and I was one of these kids before, like when I was very young. It was, even here, but 45, 40 years ago, thinking you might be gay was not something you announced lightly to your family. So this kid in New York City, there's a school for a grade school for gay students and a high school for gay students who are rejected from their families because it happens. He says, in the 6th grade, I realized I was gay. I came out to my parents. I didn't feel great myself. But I was afraid of going to school because I had stomach aches. I was being bullied and harassed. So that, certainly doesn't lead to a good environment to do well in school. So internalized homophobia, you experiencing discrimination was clearly associated with some self-destructive behavior like unprotected sex. So who cares about me? No one cares about me, so what do I care? Might as well have unprotected sex, and lots of it. So definitely associated with high-risk behavior with respect to HIV transmission. And since you don't feel if you have a medical problem and you don't want to go to the doctors because you feel your doctor is going to reject you because you're gay. So it leads in delays in seeking care for gay people and as well as trans people. If you think that homosexuality was declassified as a disease only in 1973 in the US and the World Health Organization in 1990. So really a lot of LGBTs feel like they were treated as second-class citizens because their behavior is deemed, quote, outside of the norm. In the USA and Canada, you still have issues like COBRA, which is the health insurance. Yes, if you're employed and you leave your employment, you may have some health benefits for a while, but your spouse may not necessarily be entitled to this. I think it's changing slowly because of the legality of gay marriage since a few years throughout the states. In Canada, hopefully that doesn't happen. Parental leave is a big deal. When I give my patients 6 weeks of maternity leave, which I think is too little, it's not only to recover from childbirth, but also to establish bonding between you and your baby. My husband and I, we have 2 kids, age 4 and 7, that we had through surrogacy. I was given 1 paid paternity leave, and my husband was given none. So, establishing a bond, it's not really encouraged. And if you can only take it if you can afford for it and have a vacation. And needless to say, in some countries, it's an offense. You can go to jail or be killed if you're gay. I'm going to skip that. Let's look at some concerns in the LGBT population. In the lesbian population, there's clearly an association between self-reporting being lesbian and smoking, alcohol abuse, obesity, weight gain, leading to these patients seeing Lawrence and other people with cardiovascular diseases because of obesity, diabetes, and unhealthy behavior. Cancer prevention, that's probably an effect of lack of insurance in some places like the US where your spouse may work, you don't, so you don't have any health benefits. So in terms of cancer screening, that leads to bad outcomes as well. In terms of STI, it's probably the same or even less STI in the lesbian population. Lesbian health concern, don't assume that if your patient is a lesbian, she doesn't need birth control. Maybe she has sex with men every now and then, she wants birth control. Maybe she wants to get pregnant, her and her partner. So that's important to address as well. Increase, I'm going to go quickly because I don't have too much time left. Increase healthcare, mental health issues in the gay population. Increased incidence of anxiety disorder, depression, use of antidepressant in the LGBT population compared to the heterosexual population. And suicide attempts are more common in the LGBTs, and not only they're more common, they're more likely to be successful. So something to keep in mind. Kids are more likely to be homeless. In the sample of New York City homeless kids, 25% of them were gay from the LGBT population. Because they were rejected by family, they have to resort living on the street. And the gay elder at the other end of the spectrum, gay elders are more likely to have a little social support. They're more likely not to have a spouse. 90% of LGBT elders don't have children. So that's a big deal. I'm not going to talk about too much transgender healthcare issues, but there are some good references out there I'll be happy to share with you. This is a story of a trans man who went to the ER with some bony pain, was found to have metastases because he was never told that after his mastectomy, he still had a risk of breast cancer. His sister and his mother died of breast cancer. So because no one took a history. That's my family. With our 2 kids via gestational surrogacy, our kids are 4 and 7. They're conceived the same day, but born 3 years apart. And that was I feel really fortunate I was able to become a parent, and I feel privileged, and it's not easy. So what can we do? At McGill and other places, the Joint Commission and Order Organization recognized this as a problem in LGBT patients in terms of health outcomes and the way they are surveyed. So you have to create intake forms that are inclusive, okay? That ask the questions. Are you gay? Are you straight? Do you have sex with men, sex with women? And ensure confidentiality. Train your staff, okay, to respect people that are LGBTs. Post some non-discrimination posters all over your office saying you might not be gay, you might not be a gynecologist, but you're an ally, okay? That's okay. You're a lesbian, you're gay, you can have good care here. Your intake form should be all-inclusive. And assess your environment, assess your work environment, your nurses, your medical students, you have some gay ones, some nurses, do they feel welcome at work? And I'm going to end this here in terms of family matters. Like I said, we all came as a society from a place from centuries ago in some societies where you're forced to have kids. You don't have a choice. You have to create a family. Now I think we're moving away to realize that it should be a choice if you want to become a parent or not. But in some places like France, it's illegal to be a gay parent. You can go to jail if you discuss surrogacy even. So in Quebec, surrogacy is not legal compensated surrogacy, but at least gay parenting, I think you may have the right to adopt a child if you're a gay person, but it's not the same in the majority of countries. In many places, if you admit yourself as a gay person or a gay couple, you can't adopt kids. So I think surrogacy is unfortunately very costly. To have a journey in surrogacy is between $100,000 and $200,000 per child. So it's something the majority of gay people can't afford, and that's unfortunate. So I think the next step would be make it, covered by insurance. Maybe that's a dream, but at least make it not illegal like it is in France. So there's a lot of references out there on providing healthy medical care to LGBT population. So I'm going to end here and be happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, George. We're going to now have time for a couple of questions. We're going to eat into our little break, and so we have a question here, and we'll figure out when we're starting here.
There are a lot of surveys from the 80s and 90s about prejudice against gay people, and I was wondering to what extent you think some of that may not have been distress or bias against the orientation, but may have been concern over the linkage between gay people and what was at that time a terminal disease, namely AIDS.
Yeah, I can just imagine the way it was. When you didn't know how AIDS was transmitted, I can totally see the time where medical students, nurses, or physicians were afraid to touch their gay patients because they might have, been exposed to HIV, which maybe was not testable then at some point. They didn't know they hadn't identified the virus. So probably a lot of it came from it. But I'm sure it existed well before HIV was around. There's no doubt about it. It was discrimination because of, the non-openness on a lot of religious institutions and a lot of countries, and we're just stigmatized and marginalized.
Any other questions? Great, comment.
Just a comment, George. I don't know if you know, but on the Canadian passport application now, under gender, it's male, female, or other. I just filled one out recently, so it was quite...
It shouldn't be gender, it should be sex.
I think it was gender, but I won't swear to that. Maybe it was sex. I didn't listen close enough.
And just related to that as well, when you apply for a CIHR grant right now, you have to tell how you're going to adjust for sex and for gender in your research.
As it should.
Okay, I think we're going to, one last question? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Georges. Thanks for that presentation. There's another aspect that I sometimes live at home. I have a 16-year-old son. He goes to a boys-only school, and from the conversations he tells me about that happened between him and the other students, there seems to be this sort of attitude that they're accepting of LGBT, but they sort of make a lot of criticisms about it being sort of like frivolous, like today the person feels like this, the other day the person feels like that. And so it's not hardcore stigmatization, but there's sort of this attitude that I hope that he will grow out of, but that a lot of the LGBT issues are sort of superficial and frivolous. Do you think in the educational system there's a little bit of fine tuning that could be done with respect to that?
I don't know exactly. I think, you know, I heard in a couple of high school students saying like, oh, it's so gay. And that's used kind of negatively for sure. But I don't know what it means. If it means frivolous or superficial, I think it should be, you know, in high school, and I would hope, my kids are still too young, but there will be some kind of lecture or discussion with the teacher. It's like, if you're gay, it's okay. You're accepted. You don't have to act on it right now. But, you know, I wish I had that when I was a grade school student, because I felt very foreign, very unique in my environment. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so we've got to the point. Thank you. Thanks to all our speakers, especially for trying to stay on time. So we're going to take 15 minutes, so we'll be back at 10:02, but we're really going to be back at 10:02 because we have as many good speakers. So have fun, catch up with everybody.
So our next speaker is Matt Remini. Who is a graduate of the class of '92, imagine that. She is the chief of the Department of Medical Imaging at LaSalle General Hospital and assistant professor at McGill University. She did her residency in diagnostic radiology at McGill and completed a fellowship in musculoskeletal at UDM. Her areas of interest include all aspects of radiology, namely ultrasound, except for cardiac, I'm presuming. CT colonoscopy, MRI. She serves as the vice president of the executive committee of the Centre Intégré Sanitaire de Services et Services Sociaux d'Orval-Lachine-LaSalle, and is a board member of the Fondation de l'Hôpital de LaSalle, is currently chief of diagnostic imaging at LaSalle General Hospital, as I said. Current research interests include the role of MR in prostatic artery embolization for BPH and post-therapy MR evaluation of Alzheimer's disease. She's going to be giving us a talk which was widely and well received at the annual McGill Family Medicine Refresher course. And welcome, thank you.
Hello, everyone. You can't see my knees shaking, so I'm going to try and speak slowly. I just want to say I am absolutely humbled at the accomplishments of the previous speakers, and just being humbled just as being accepted as one of these conference speakers with all the people and all the talent that we have here. So I want to say that I, like Lawrence, unfortunately was unable to escape Quebec. They kept me here. I did not get a get-out-of-jail-free card, unfortunately. But it has given me opportunities, and although I cannot say that I started a medical program like Sister Monique, which I am humbled again by your accomplishments, I was able to begin and start the radiology department in my hospital from scratch and work in administration a lot, so it's given me a lot of opportunity to learn, and hopefully I can share some of these with you. So let's see if I can do this properly. So I want to also thank especially the organizing committee for their work in arranging this conference. I have no disclosures. So we're going to begin this talk by a couple of scenarios that we see commonly, or GPs commonly see when they present, when they have patients presenting. So the first case is a 26-year-old woman who presents with lower abdominal pain. Her symptoms and signs include elevated white blood cell count, a low-grade fever. What do we do next? A 30-year-old woman, she's 32 weeks pregnant. She presents with lower abdominal pain. Her symptoms and signs include elevated white blood cell count, low fever. The initial ultrasound showed fluid in the right lower quadrant. What do we do next? A 35-year-old woman, she's 36 weeks pregnant. She complains of severe debilitating headache. Her symptoms and signs include confusion, high blood pressure. What do we do next? And finally, a 20-year-old Crohn's patient presents with nonspecific lower abdominal pain. His symptoms and signs include low-grade fever, slightly elevated white blood cell count, and no rebound. What do we do next? All of the previous cases probably, so why is it important to image wisely? All of the previous cases probably will involve some form of imaging. Imaging is one of the greatest medical advancements of all time. Imaging techniques have revolutionized healthcare in disease detection and treatment planning. In a survey by MDs, imaging, especially advanced imaging, including CT and MR, was voted as the third most important medical development in the last 50 years. The value of imaging to the medical community can be seen by its use. This slide from the Centers of Disease Control shows a steady increase in advanced imaging, especially CT, in emergency departments in the United States from 1999 to 2008. In fact, between 2000 and 2007, imaging was the fastest growing physician service in the Medicare population. This fact has not been ignored by American insurers. America's Health Insurance Plans, which is an advocacy group for American insurance agencies, claimed that medical imaging was being overused, and 20 to 50% of all high-tech, which means for the insurance companies, very expensive for them, imaging provided no useful information and may in fact be unnecessary. If we accept that this is true, that there is an over-reliance on imaging, what are some of the causes? Well, firstly, especially in the United States, malpractice issues drive imaging. Many doctors feel that patients won't sue for finding something, even if it's inconsequential, but they will sue for missing something. Self-referral has also been touted as one of the reasons for over-imaging, with advanced medical imaging being installed in MD offices, including cardiologists, radiologists, and rheumatologists. Again, if we accept that there's too much imaging, why is it bad? The cost of the healthcare system is amplified. Unexpected or incidental findings result in a cascade of unnecessary diagnostic and therapeutic interventions. And while each of these reasons are important in and of themselves, today we're really going to focus on excessive radiation. 70 million CT scans are performed annually in the United States, mostly CTs of the abdomen, chest, and head. Although they represent only 17% of radiation-based medical procedures, they contribute to about 50% of the medical radiation dose to the population as a whole. And this last statistic, this freaks people out. Terms like radiation send off alarm bells, and several articles in the lay press, including the New York Times, have warned about excessive radiation from CT. But is this true? CTs are popular because they provide an accurate diagnosis that many specialties depend on to provide the best care for their patients. Overlooked in the debate on the theoretical risk of cancer from a CT scan is the risk of not performing a CT examination. CT scans can save lives, reduce costs, and improve patient outcomes in multiple clinical scenarios, such as trauma and stroke. I think that we can all agree that no patient should be denied any imaging investigation that is critical to their management. So let's see if my films work. Okay, we'll let that run. With all the things that CT can do, how do we make an informed decision on when to use it? So I just want to ad-lib here. When I started medical school and I did a rotation in radiology, this was not what I was thought that radiology could do. I just got x-rays from a dusty jacket. But this is what radiology can do right now, 25 years later. So with that question in mind, the objectives of my talk are to understand the importance of clinical information when requesting imaging, understand the ALARA principle, and become familiar with some common CT protocols and their radiation doses. So who looks at requisitions? Radiologists look at requisitions for advanced medical imaging, including CT and MR. We do this in order to prioritize studies based on urgency, as well as to optimize the protocol for the pathology being investigated. And we can also suggest alternate or better studies. But to do this, we need clinical information. Clinical information is key to avoid errors and to reduce risks. Radiologists should be partners in patient care with their referring physicians. Radiologists can impact healthcare to minimize the risk and costs associated with inappropriate utilization patterns, but in order to do this, again, we need information from referring doctors. Clinicians should be specific when stating reasons for the study and the specific diagnostic questions to be answered. They should also provide more thorough clinical histories, including age, previous surgeries, and chronic conditions such as Crohn's. Our role as radiologists is to protocol the study appropriately based on clinical information. In protocoling the study, we follow the ALARA principle. ALARA stands for as low as reasonably achievable, and we try to keep radiation dose as low as possible if in fact radiation is needed at all, while still being able to make a diagnosis. To begin to understand how to minimize dose, we need to review some physics to understand some radiation, radiation and some of its effects. We're going to use the pregnant woman who requires imaging as an example. In scientific units, the radiation dose to the adult is expressed in millisieverts, while the dose to the fetus is expressed in milligray. Grays are a direct measure of radiation dose, while sieverts incorporate a weighting factor that expresses the dose's effect on the tissue. Gonads and breast tissue, for example, will have higher weighting factors, especially in children and young adults, than long bones. The fetus is treated as one unit. All fetal tissue is assumed to receive the same risk for radiation. So we're going to begin with the fetus. Overall radiation risk is divided into deterministic and stochastic effects. Deterministic effects are those that require a dose threshold before damage occurs. These are the teratogenic effects of radiation and include malformations and growth retardation. Pregnancies in the first and second trimester are the most vulnerable, but there are no significant deterministic effects below 100 milligray. Happily, normal exposure in diagnostic radiology never results in fetal doses that are greater than 100 milligray. This is the 2016 committee opinion from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, which essentially says the same thing that I just said, that the radiation exposure for radiography, CT, or nuclear medicine is at a much lower dose than that associated with fetal harm and should not be withheld from a pregnant patient if deemed necessary. This slide summarizes fetal dose. Again, we're going to talk about milligray from some common imaging procedures. The radiation dose received from plain films is minimal. The fetus receives only 1 milligray from a head CT and roughly 50 milligrays from an abdominal pelvic CT. But don't forget, we've got to deal with stochastic risks, that there's this other component. Stochastic risks are the carcinogenic risk resulting from random damage to DNA strands, and they don't require a threshold dose, and the theoretical risk increases with increasing radiation dose. Stochastic effects are assessed through the risk of developing childhood cancer as a result of radiation exposure. The baseline risk of dying from childhood cancer is 1 to 2.5 patients per 1,000. So this is important, so I'm going to slow down. The risk of cancer, the risk of getting childhood cancer after you've had one CT, an abdomen pelvis CT, which is about 50 milligrays, increases to 1.1 to 3 patients per 1,000, which means that the increase in your risk is only 1 to 5 per 10,000. So that's what you want to tell your patients when you need to get a CT done. What is the risk to my baby? The risk for deterministic effects is nothing. Don't worry about it. No teratogenic effects. But the risk of dying from childhood cancer is your increase is only 1 to 5 per 10,000. So the fetus is pretty much okay from radiation received from all diagnostic imaging procedures. What about mom? When speaking about mom, the radiation risk is expressed in millisieverts to emphasize its effect on the specific tissue being imaged. So to get a feel for millisieverts, let's remember that we deal with radiation every day. This is background radiation. Some sources of this type of naturally occurring radiation include radon, the atmosphere as a result of radiation from outer space, and the food that we ingest and the air that we breathe. Each year, Americans receive an average dose from natural background radiation of about 3.1 millisieverts. We are aware that high doses of radiation clearly causes health risks, including death. However, the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements concluded that with doses between 50 to 100 millisieverts, the risks are either too small to be observed or non-existent. The take-home message was to limit quantitative doses to between 50 to 100 millisieverts per lifetime. So let's look at the radiation doses received from common imaging. We can see that doses from plain film radiography are typically below 1 millisievert, well below background radiation. With CT imaging, the numbers to remember are 1, 5, and 10. If you remember nothing else, it's really easy, 1, 5, and 10. A CT head is about 1 millisievert, a CT chest is about 5 millisieverts, and a CT abdomen pelvis is about 10 millisieverts. If a CT scan of the abdomen pelvis results in 10 millisieverts, then a patient receiving 10 of these scans in his or her lifetime would receive a 100 millisievert total accumulated dose, which is equivalent to the lowest levels received by the Japanese atomic bomb survivors. And although risk is probably a lot more complex than just accumulated dose, a good rule to follow is the rule of 10. If a patient was going to live 10 years and may receive more than 10 CT scans in those 10 years, consider alternate imaging, such as ultrasound or MR. So now that we have a little bit better understanding of radiation risk, we can review some of the common CT protocols and the radiation doses. So typical requisitions that I receive for head CTs include confusion, stroke, bleed, trauma, and vertigo. The radiation dose from a standard head CT is about 1 millisievert. Okay, if there is one thing to remember from this talk, just go home and you remember me speaking, it is never not do a head CT in a patient when you think it will when you think it will help because you were scared of the radiation dose. Even in a pregnant woman, the benefits will almost always outweigh the risks. CT is fast, it's easily available at all hours, and it's excellent for bleeds. In the setting of stroke, which is a clinical diagnosis, even though CT is not as sensitive as MR, its value is really to detect whether or not there's blood. And these are two different patients. The patient on your right is one with a non-hemorrhagic stroke, and the patient on your left is the one with hemorrhagic stroke, and they're both treated differently based on the CT findings. For a CT chest protocols, a low-dose CT scan is performed for requisitions with clinical information of screening or micronodules. And this reduced dose is only 20% of the standard CT dose, or 20% of 5 millisieverts. It's only 1 millisievert. A pulmonary embolism study is performed from the base of the neck to adrenals with a radiation dose of about 5 millisieverts. This is an example of a young woman with a small pulmonary embolus. Not only do we find the PE, but we also find its likely source, a filling defect in the left subclavian vein. At the same time, we can look at the lungs to make sure that there are no pulmonary infarcts, pneumonias, or tumors. This is a comparison of radiation doses from a pulmonary embolus CT scan with a VQ scans. In my practice, we use CT really because we can get it at all times and we can identify other pathologies that can mimic PE. But in a pregnant woman, I really want to encourage everyone to maybe think about isolated perfusion scans because that can reduce the radiation dose to the patient's breast tissue to under 1 millisievert. In a typical request that I receive for nonspecific abdominal pain, a standard one-phase abdominal pelvic CT scan is done with a dose of about 10 millisieverts. CT is the best test for small ureteral stones because most of these patients will present many times to the ER. The standard CT protocols are low dose, and we keep it low to around 4 to 8 millisieverts, depending on the patient's body habitus. We're still going to be able to detect those stones, but other findings are not going to have the same type of resolution that we get with standard CT scans, and they're probably going to require further imaging later on. When we get protocols requesting characterization of a liver or renal lesion, the standard protocols are triphasic. The lesion is imaged without contrast and then imaged in the arterial and venous phases. And this type of imaging increases the dose up to 2.5 times, or about 25 millisieverts. So I'm going to show you an example of such a case. You can see that the organ, the liver itself is imaged 3 times, 1 non-contrast, 1 arterial phase contrast, and 1 in the venous phase contrast. In that case, that type of imaging was essential because it was planning for chemoembolization. However, many times the lesions that are being imaged are likely benign or slow growing. Only their stability or resolution needs to be documented, and these are hemangiomas. These are low-grade cysts in the kidney that have low malignant potential, and really we shouldn't be doing CT on these type of cases. We should be following them up with ultrasound and MR. Typical acute aortic syndromes are triphasic studies that will go from the thyroid to the thigh. This will give radiation doses to about 25 to 30 millisieverts, but in these settings, radiation risk is not the factor. You're going to try and save this patient's life, and the diagnostic CT will definitely impact management, and again, the benefits will outweigh the risks. That's a typical type B dissection, clearly visualized by CT. So, in summary, CT scans can save lives, put CT risk into perspective, and consider alternate imaging, especially in patients who will need constant follow-up. So if we can go back to our cases and we can see how well I did as a teacher, and see if we all can agree on the same imaging protocol. So the first case was a 26-year-old woman. She presented with lower abdominal pain, her symptoms and signs, elevated white blood cell count, and low-grade fever. What do we do next? So our imaging options include no imaging, and I can tell you right now that's probably not going to be the right answer because I'm a radiologist, so we're going to image. Ultrasound, CT, or MR, and I don't know if a show of hands, how many people think it's going to be ultrasound? Okay, how many people think it's going to be CT? And how many people think it's going to be MR? Okay, so in this case, it's a young, thin woman, and I think ultrasound is the first choice. In this case, the ultrasound was diagnostic. We found an appendicitis with a fecalith. Usually in patients with BMIs of less than 30, ultrasound is a pretty good first choice. All right. 30-year-old woman, 32 weeks pregnant. She presents with lower abdominal pain. Her symptoms and signs include elevated white blood cell count, low-grade fever. We already did the ultrasound. All we found was fluid in the right lower quadrant. What do we do next? Our imaging options, no further imaging required, CT or MR. So show of hands, how many people would do a CT in this person? And how many people would do MR in this person? All right, so in the 3rd trimester, ultrasounds are typically of little value because a gravid uterus makes identifying the appendix extremely challenging. So we want to try and avoid unnecessary radiation. This is the ALARA principle. So if you have it and if it's available, I think the next step should be MR. And this is the MR of that patient. And she has a nice appendicitis here, which is seen. And after the diagnosis was made by was made by MR, the patient went to the OR. But you're not wrong if you chose CT. I saw the audience was clearly divided. If you chose CT and you said, you know what, I'm saving this patient's life, I think that and you don't have MR available, then absolutely that would be a valid choice. A 36-year-old woman, 36 weeks pregnant, complains of severe debilitating headache, and her symptoms and signs include confusion and high blood pressure. What do we do next? No imaging required. Ultrasound, CT, or MR. So how many people would choose ultrasound? Great. How many people would choose CT? Okay, my job is done. Thank you for that. And how many people would choose MR? Okay, well, actually I saw one hand up there, but that's great, okay. So she underwent that CT that revealed no bleed, but these hypodensities in the posterior white matter, and she went on to have an MR, which showed the same abnormalities in the white matter, a little bit better than CT. And this is posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. The white matter abnormalities usually come back to normal, with most patients making a full recovery, but the take-home message in this talk is go for that CT. CT saved lives, 1 millisievert to the brain for that young woman, and it changes her management. So our final case is the 20-year-old Crohn's patient who presented with nonspecific lower abdominal pain, and his symptoms and signs included low-grade fever, slightly elevated white blood cell count, and no rebound. What do we do next? So our options here include abdominal series, ultrasound, CT, and MR. So abdominal series, anybody? Somebody said, who said abdominal series? Can you go back? Abdominal series? Okay, I see Aaron said abdominal series, so that's good. Ultrasound, CT, okay, MR. All right. I almost never, ever advocate for abdominal plain films. I think they're pretty useless, but this is one of the few cases that I say abdominal series. So way to go, Aaron, you're still the smartest guy I know. So, I'm going to go on. Yeah, sorry. So Steve is just questioning your choice, but anyway. So I almost never do abdominal plain films, but this is one of the few cases. The patient is stable, okay? The clinical picture is certainly not one of an abscess, and really all you want to know is he obstructed or not? You know that this guy is presenting with Crohn's, and you know that that's what you're looking for. If more advanced imaging is required by the gastroenterologist to identify and measure the length of the affected segments of bowel or to better assess response to treatment, I would advocate to go for MR enterography. And this is a different patient. This isn't the patient that I spoke about, but this is a patient who presented to the ER with a diffuse abdominal pain. He ended up getting the CT just because they didn't know what he had. The CT would diagnose Crohn's disease, and so we followed this patient up with MR. And I don't know if you can hear me as I can point here, but this is the affected segment here on CT, and it's CT. I love CT. I absolutely love it, but MR, it will show you that same segment almost better, and that's really all you want for this person. And he's only 20 years old. He's going to present many times in many different hospitals and many different ERs with the same symptoms, and you really want to try and reduce radiation to this patient as much as possible. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
That was great, Matt. Any questions? Just while we're waiting for the microphone, one quick question about what happens south of the border. Often immigrates, depending on executive orders, migrates northward. Where are we, do you think, in terms of application of appropriate use criteria and pre-approval for high-level diagnostic imaging in Canada?
I have the extreme pleasure of working in Quebec under the Quebec Ministry of Health. And so for those of you who are Quebec doctors, I think you know what I mean by that. And I think that we're very close. We're very close. Appropriateness criteria, I just as an example, I do a lot of virtual colonoscopy. And the screening for colon cancer that's approved by the Quebec government is the fecal blood test, which doesn't detect polyps, it detects cancer. So, and why? Because it saves money for the government. So absolutely, I think we're already there for things like virtual colonoscopy, which they won't pay for, and they won't pay for the colonoscopy. And so I think that you're going to see more and more appropriateness criteria that they're going to use based on insurers, based on insurer information, and I absolutely see it coming, if it's not already well implemented and in place.
Is that on? I see a problem, particularly in the States, where there's a reflex from the emergency department as well as in the hospital to do an imaging study almost before the examination is done. And I see no attempt to have a system to monitor the amount of imaging that's been done. So I recall a patient who had chronic inflammatory bowel disease who had been in multiple different states over time, and she had had well over 50 CT scans. No tracking at all about what's been done. So how can we approach this?
I think that's really an excellent question, and I think that I make fun of the Quebec healthcare system, but that is one of the things that they have addressed. And so we have a registry of, they're trying anyway, our information technology in Quebec is not that great, but they're trying to have a registry of all Quebecers. And so as a radiologist, if you come into my hospital, I can see what has been done in other hospitals. And so the onus, unfortunately, right now is on the radiologist because they have access to all of those prior studies to say, you know what, this is maybe the 7th CT scan that you've had. Maybe I can call the ER and say, maybe you don't do the CT. The practicality of doing that on a day-to-day basis is almost impossible. We don't have the resources or the time to screen every requisition that's coming, but I think that in places like Boston, like in Harvard, they do have systems where they have a clinician manager who actually gets all the requisitions in, and they go into the system and they look at the patient's previous history as to how much radiation they've received, and they will actually call back the referring physician, and they'll say, maybe you want to, you know, the reason that we're not doing your study is because of previous radiation. But I think that what we see from the States, again, going back to Lawrence's question, what you will see more and more on radiation reports, and this is coming, not only will there be something that talks about body mass index, because patients are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so we can't say fat because that's not socially acceptable. So we say with a challenged body mass index, you're going to see that in the reports, and you're also going to see the radiation dose received at the end of your report. As a radiologist, we have to report that. Whose responsibility is it ultimately? I think it's a group responsibility. I think the radiologist, the referring physician, we all have to take responsibility, because we all took the Hippocratic Oath. It's do no harm. We want to save people. We don't want to hurt them. So I think that those are things that are coming, and we will document all of those.
I practice south of the border, and our radiologists have managed to insert themselves between the ordering physicians and the insurance companies to be the gatekeepers and safeguard the public against all those other nasty physicians who are ordering x-rays all the time and CT scans. And at the same time, it's rare for me to get a report, a CAT scan report that says, suggests follow-up imaging in 6 months. So how do you reconcile that with your colleagues who are maybe trying to practice medical legal medicine versus patient safety?
I'm not sure I really understood your question, but I'm going to answer the question that I think that you asked me. So I know that I suggest follow-up imaging when it's medically warranted. And if the patient has a cyst that I think is worrisome, or a mass or an adrenal mass that I think is worrisome, I'm there for the patient. I'm the patient's advocate. I'm going to request follow-up imaging. I can't speak for all my colleagues. I can only speak for myself, but I think that that's the way most radiologists approach things. It's in what's in the best interest of the patient, not in the best interest of themselves. I think that radiologists should be gatekeepers. I think that we have a better understanding of radiation risks and imaging. I think we have a better understanding of what imaging is the best imaging to be done, depending on the clinician, on the information that you're giving me. So I think that I have no problem with radiologists actually being the gatekeepers. I'm not sure if I answered your question. So.
I just want to add one little bit to that, because I recently got a report where they were suggesting alternate imaging and additional imaging. Because the clinician doesn't always supply all the information, what I did is I just called up the radiologist, spoke with the radiologist, said, what do you really think the probability of whatever you're suggesting really is? And we had a discussion. Based on the discussion, I decided I did not need that additional imaging.
And I know for people who work at my hospital, you can always call the radiologist up. I mean, I always answer my phone calls. I mean, it's hard to do that in every single practice, obviously, but yeah, I think communication with the radiologist would be the best way to avoid sort of stupid follow-up imaging, quote unquote, or follow-up imaging that could be detrimental to the patient. So.
Great. I wish we had more time, but we have to go on. Thanks, Matt. Our next speaker is Brian Silver, who also graduated in '92 here from McGill and went on to do neurology and is the vice chair and professor of neurology, which is a new program approved in 2014 by the trustees of the University of Massachusetts, where Brian came from Rhode Island hospital before that, and some time at Brown University. He's had a great interest in stroke and is going to bring us up to date on what we do, the brain attack, and he's going to talk about that and what we should be doing better in 2017.
All right. Thank you very much, Harold, and it is an honor to be here. Similarly, I'm humbled following such great talks previously. What I'm going to try to do is a whirlwind, I guess, of CAT scan use in, all right. How do I get to the next talk? How do I get to the next talk? I won't do it as well as Matt did it. No. I have to say it is a little bizarre being this close to the screen. I used to sit way back up there, so it feels unnatural being this close. All right. Yep. Okay. So here are my disclosures. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition and diagnosis of stroke as it has evolved over time. Talk a little bit about the indications for acute stroke and TIA management, and then what is now of interest to me is recovering from stroke, which may spill into other areas of neurological damage. So what is a stroke and what is a TIA? William Cole first introduced the term stroke in 1689 in a treatise where he described it as a physical medical essay concerning late frequencies of apoplexies. But the term stroke itself did not come into common usage until the early 1900s. So if you try to do a PubMed review, you won't see stroke except as it applies to heat stroke. And prior to that term, for about 2,000 years, the word apoplexy was being used as was introduced by Hippocrates in about 400 BC. In the 1950s, and I'm going to be a little bit of a homer because this is where a Montreal connection occurs, C. Miller Fisher, who's in the Medical Hall of Fame, was an alumnus of the Royal Victoria Hospital and MNI, introduced the term transient ischemic attack. And since that time, there have been arbitrary distinctions between stroke and TIA, and essentially it's based on the length of the day. So if we lived on Jupiter, it could be 450 days for a TIA. Nevertheless, the current WHO definition introduced in 1970 has not changed and still is a rapidly developing clinical sign of focal or global disturbance of cerebral function lasting more, and here's the time frame, of 24 hours or leading to death with no apparent cause other than that of vascular origin. So there's no tissue-based definition that it's all time-based. So because of the advantage in neuroimaging in the last 20 years, and this follows on the heel of Matt's talk, specifically the development of diffusion-weighted MR imaging, roughly 1/3 of the events that we previously called stroke are now termed TIA. So here's an example. This is a person who's 45 years of age who comes in with a 30-minute episode of right side weakness. And so what you can see there, the arrow is pointing to something in the internal capsule. So before we had this imaging, this might be buried in a CT scan, which you should still do as your first study. Okay, we're clear on that. So you can see, so you do the MRI and you see this study, this finding, and so according to the old definition, the person still has a stroke, but none of us these days would call this a TIA. This would be called, in the old definition it would be called TIA because the symptom was 30 minutes. But because there's a tissue injury here, this is now reclassified as a stroke. And we've been using this technology for about 20 years. It was introduced in the 1990s. There is another sequence called the flare sequence, which I won't show here, but that's more like the A1C of the brain, whereas this is the glucose of the brain. So the flare sequence will show you the lifetime accumulation of ischemic damage. And what we now recognize is that the more of these subcortical infarcts you develop, the more likely you are to develop dementia. So if you have even one of these lesions, it doubles or triples your risk of developing dementia. If you have a second one, it quadruples or quintuples your risk of dementia. So as I accumulate amyloid in my brain, my other thing I'm worried about is accumulating these small, deep subcortical strokes. So with the impending aging of the population, we're also worried about this explosion of dementia that eventually is going to happen, we think, by about 2050 or so, and this will be a worldwide issue. So simple things like controlling blood pressure can help reduce dementia, and there have been reports from Ontario where they had aggressive campaigns to treat stroke, and their dementia rates actually started declining. So there is now epidemiologic evidence tying reduction of stroke risk with averting dementia in some people. So I won't read this whole thing out, but suffice it to say the current definition of stroke now contains both time as well as tissue imaging. So not every place has MRI imaging. I live kind of in a glass bubble myself where we have MRI all the time, but in places where you have a CAT scan, if you do happen to see a stroke on the CAT scan, even with a short duration of symptoms, that patient is classified as having a stroke. And I think there's movement afoot to have the World Health Organization change that definition to incorporate imaging as part of the definition. So does the emergent management of TIA actually make a difference? So fine, we have these patients come in, they have a transient episode of trouble speaking, weakness on one side. What should we do? So this is a study that was done in the UK, and there similar studies have been done in France, and then now a worldwide study. Essentially, what they changed between the phase 1 of the study and the phase 2 of the study was doing emergency department evaluation or 24-hour after the event clinic evaluation. And what they did quicker was get the patients to certain treatments. So getting the patients quicker to statin, getting them quicker to carotid endarterectomy when it was appropriate. Those were the two major things, and getting them more quickly on blood pressure medicine. So that's the operational side of things. What about on the outcome side of things? And this is what this slide shows, that the reduction in risk of stroke was reduced by 80%. So instead of having the patient wait 3 to 4 weeks to go see primary care physician, cardiologist, neurologist, radiologist, or whoever, it's better off for that patient to be seen within 24 hours of the event to avert 8 out of 10 strokes. And so now that's the common practice to, at least in the States now, is to have these TIA units either in the emergency department or next day clinics where patients are evaluated quickly to institute the treatment quickly. So we tend to think of TIAs as not emergent events, but I think the literature over the last 10 to 15 years now establishes it as an emergency and as a treatable emergency. So I'm going to just turn to acute stroke. This is a slide that we always like to show, showing the relationship between time and treatment. The earlier we treat patients within the time course of an acute stroke, the better the outcome. If we can treat somebody within the first hour of their stroke, approximately 80% of them will return to normal. So each minute is very important. And there's another concept we talk about, which is save a minute, save a day. So for every minute that we can avert or get to treatment, the time or the disability that's prevented is increased substantially, and it's the same between men and women. And actually, the younger you are, the earlier you treat the patient in the window compared to an older person, there's even more disability that's prevented. And similarly for intra-arterial treatments, which are now appropriate treatments for people with large vessel occlusions in the brain, this is now well-established treatment. Similarly, patients who are treated earlier in the window do much better. And so the message to the population is if you're having stroke-like symptoms, you want to call 911 and get to the emergency department as quickly as possible. So I'm going to touch on this very quickly. There are certain changes that we look on CT scan. There's something called the aspect scoring system, which was developed out of Calgary. And this was a semi-quantitative way of establishing where the areas of injury in the brain are, and they have 10 zones. And here you can see one example where there's early changes shown by the arrow. And so this patient would get at least 2 points for 2 zones that are being affected. Here's another scan showing a zone being affected, so that's 1 point for that. And the more zones you have affected earlier on, the less likely you are going to be able to have a good outcome, if you can see this early on in CT scan. There's another system that we use now, so we use CTAs now fairly frequently in acute stroke. The Calgarians actually now advocate that all acute stroke patients should have a CT-CTA. I can't say that that's universally adopted as an opinion. That's their opinion. There's a lot of back and forth discussion about whether that's appropriate. But you can see very nicely on these MIP projections for CTA, you can see where the occlusion is indicated by the arrow. And the other thing that CTA can do is show this new concept of collateral scoring. So if you look at the top set of rows, you can see what are good collaterals, so both sides look roughly equal. If you look at the middle, there's a little bit of imbalance, and if you look at the bottom set of rows, there's a definite imbalance between the number of blood vessels on one side versus the other. And we know that the people who have the poor collaterals are the ones who are probably not going to respond even to intra-arterial treatment. So some radiologists will use this as a triage system to figure out when it's futile and when it's appropriate to treat the patient. Now, this is hot off the press. We always talk about a 6-hour window for patients with acute stroke who are appropriate candidates for large vessel occlusion. But these 2 trials, which are probably going to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine probably in February, are both going to show that even in the extended time window, now going up to 24 hours, in highly selected patients, you can still pull out the clot and have an excellent outcome. So the number needed to treat in these trials is actually 3. So 1 out of 3 patients who are treated will return to an excellent outcome. So this will certainly change our practice. And what they're using is a mismatch on imaging. So this is an MR-based imaging sequence where you, on the left, you can see the area of damaged tissue. On the right, the perfusion deficit. And visually, you can see, at least on the top set of rows, hopefully you can see from the back there, the core is smaller than the ischemic area, and so there's a mismatch. And on the bottom set of rows, they're roughly the same size. So that's not a mismatch. That would be a patient who would be selected out from treatment. You have to have a mismatch in order to be selected for treatment. Oops. Okay. So you can do the same thing on CAT scan. There's special software that is now available called the RAPID software. And dye is injected, and what it will do is it will look for blood flow patterns. On the left, you can see in pink where the core damages. This is 70% reduction in blood flow, which is defined and validated as core damage. And on the right is the ischemic area. So again, there's a mismatch between the two. So if this patient came at hour 18 after stroke and had a large vessel occlusion, we would still take that patient for embolectomy. But most patients actually do not have a mismatch. When you're coming at hour 18, there's probably a 5 or 10% chance that you're going to have a mismatch. Most people will have that area fully evolved into a stroke. So we're going to try to select out those patients. What about intracerebral hemorrhage? So this has always been a big area of controversy. How low should we lower the blood pressure after intracerebral hemorrhage? So there were 2 randomized trials examining very similar populations, and they came to completely different conclusions. One said there was no benefit to lowering the blood pressure less than 140 systolic in the acute setting, and the other which said, yes, there is a benefit. So given these 2 very disparate results, when I took a vote in my own hospital, what people wanted to do after these studies, one said less than 180 is fine, one less than 140. People said 160, so they chose the middle. Okay, so that's kind of where we are right now. Now, the other question that comes up is, let's say somebody has a bleed. When should you, or should you, ever restart their anticoagulation? So how many people currently, their patient has atrial fibrillation, they come in with an intracerebral hemorrhage, would you restart anticoagulation, say, at 30 days afterwards? Show of hands. Okay, so some people, who would not restart it? Okay. So nobody's committing to anything. That's fine. Okay. It's fine. I did the same thing when Matt was presenting her thing, especially in the neuro case. I didn't want to vote because I was afraid of getting the wrong answer. So so interesting, this was a study done in Germany. Admittedly, it's not a randomized controlled trial, but at least at that time in Germany, about 70% of German practitioners were not restarting anticoagulation after a hemorrhage had occurred, even if they had an indication such as AFib. And about 30% were. And what they saw was that when they followed patients out to 12 months, there was a significant difference in the rate of embolic stroke or recurrent events, as you'd expect. So the people who were not restarted in anticoagulation had a much greater risk, which is the top set of graph. You can see that risk is going up, but it's not going up in the people who were restarted, or just a little bit. And then the bottom graph shows the risk of hemorrhage. So intuitively, we all thought that the risk of hemorrhage was going to go up, but those lines overlap. So there's really no significant increase in the risk of bleeding, which seems odd, but that's what they found. So on the basis of this study and now some subsequent studies showing a similar phenomenon, more and more practitioners are now actively restarting patients on anticoagulation despite a bleed. There are some nuances we can get into whether or not the patient has conditions called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which is a more recently recognized phenomenon in older patients, and sometimes patients will be triaged out for that. But in general, I think if somebody has an indication for anticoagulation without a strong contraindication, despite a bleed, after 30 days, we will restart them. So now I'm going to just end with recovery treatments. This is a favorite study of mine, which is called the MUST trial. And what I like about it is, number one, it was an ingenious study. Number two, it was done in India, probably for about $100 for the 2x4s and the mirror you see here. Whereas if the NIH had funded this, this probably be about a $10 million study. So, so credit to the people who put this together. So what they did is they took people who had neglect syndromes, and this is a star cancellation test. And normally you're supposed to cross out all the stars on both sides, and if you have neglect, what happens is typically it's on the left side, only the right side gets canceled out. This similar idea, you see the line bisection test, you see the testing frame on the left. This is on the right, a subject who's gone through the test, and you can see evidence of neglect where they're bisecting the lines only on the right side, ignoring the left. And then finally, there's a picture identification task where they have to describe what's going on in the picture, and people who have neglect will ignore the children in the cookie jar and only describe the mother washing the dishes. And this was, I think, created in the 70s because it's really not politically correct anymore. The dad should be washing the dishes now. So that's just my statement. Okay. All right. So they enrolled, this wasn't a huge study. This was about 40 patients in each arm, roughly. And this is too small to see, so I'm going to skip through this part. But essentially, what they found was that the people who went through this mirror training, that is, they were looking, and you saw in that first frame, they were looking in the mirror, so they were seeing the image of their affected arm. So this was trying to trick the brain into thinking that that arm was still useful, so when you have neglect, you ignore that arm. They were, I'll go back to that slide just so you can see that. So the woman on the left, she's looking at her arm, okay, and she is seeing her right arm as an image, and they're having her do tasks with the right arm through that mirror therapy. They have a sham control, so this is another man with a stroke, but he's looking essentially at a wood box, okay, so they control for that by having the wood box there. And what they found was when it came to the line bisection task, or the star cancellation test, or the picture identification task, more often people who underwent mirror therapy had a better outcome in terms of having neglect not be part of their syndrome anymore at 3 months and then up to 6 months. But more importantly, when they looked at functional outcomes in these patients, this is taking care of themselves, being able to do their own self-care. If you look at the 3-month outcomes, 69% were dependent in the treatment group versus 95% in the control group. Oh, do I have that backwards? I'm sorry. Yeah, right. So less people who were dependent in the treatment group than the control group. So that's a huge benefit with a very simple type of intervention. And now physical therapists will routinely use that treatment. Very quickly, there are other exciting things going on, like mesenchymal cell transplantation, and this is work that is coming out of Stanford and Pittsburgh and other places. So what is done is a burr hole is created, stem cells are injected in the peri-infarct area, and between 2.5 and 10 million mesenchymal stem cells. So you can take, these aren't embryonic stem cells, so we don't necessarily have to get into that whole discussion. These are donor mesenchymal stem cells or the person's own stem cells, which are injected back into the brain. And here are the side effects, which are not insignificant. And then what we see are these changes in the brain if it's successful, and at least in anecdotal reports, people who've had, say, a weak arm for 2 years suddenly can move their arm again after the stem cells have been injected. So it's now undergoing randomized controlled trial to see whether this is another avenue of recovery. I probably have about a minute left. I did want to talk a little bit about this machine-brain interface. I don't know if I can play the image, but this is another thing that colleagues at Brown had done. Here's a microchip over here, which is smaller than a dime, as you can see. It's implanted in the brain, and it's connected to a robotic arm. And let's see if I can fast forward that. I can't. So, well, so you can see the robotic arm where she's holding the water bottle, and she's thinking about moving this robotic arm, which is connected to a computer because she's paralyzed from the neck down. And at 1 minute and 47, which I won't waste time getting to, she brings the robotic arm to her mouth. So with the thought process involving just about 100 neurons, because this is a grid of about 10, she's able to bring that robotic arm. So we're now in the era of having these brain-machine interfaces for people with disabilities. So I thought this was crazy the first time I saw this, but it's almost, it's not quite prime time yet. I think it's another 2 decades before we'll get there, but that's the state of art. So I'm going to stop there. I love neurology, obviously, and I would love to talk more, but I'm going to stop for the sake of time. Yes.
We have time for only 1 or 2 questions, and Matt has a great one here, so.
I hope it's not an imaging question. Oh, sorry.
I don't know if it's a great question, but that was fantastic. My question is, we had a huge day on teaching yesterday in my hospital about stroke, and I want to know your personal opinion. I know that there's code stroke in Quebec, meaning that there's certain hospitals that the ambulance drivers don't take the patients to. They take them directly to tertiary care centers because, as you know, time is brain. What do you feel? Do you think that patients should get that initial CT and the CTA in a peripheral hospital before being transferred to the tertiary care center? Because sometimes that imaging can take up to 45 minutes.
So that's a question that's being asked all across the United States and Canada. Do you do triage in the field? I think the right answer, this is my opinion, the right answer to that question is if you can get the EMS personnel to do a scale in the field, and if it's high enough, then they can divert in the field. If they're not able to do the scale, you don't want to overwhelm the tertiary care center by sending every stroke patient over there, then they're going to have to stop, but you have to then measure things like door in, door out times to make them efficient for the reasons you say.
I want to add 2 quick comments that all these times are tracked, and there are benchmarks that are set, and the hospitals do have to report to the government for these benchmarks, and it's taken very seriously. The other thing is, I'm told that Cleveland Clinic has an ambulance with a CT, and they do the CT in the ambulance.
Yeah, I didn't get into that. That's a whole other discussion about technology. Actually, Norway now has a helicopter with a CT because they're. Right. So so the question was, there are patients who the imaging interpretation can take some time. So some places are using Nighthawk or some remote teleinterpretation systems. So they take an expert who interprets that system.
Brian, great talk. Just for people who don't have all that imaging in your post-TIA clinic, what's the minimum? CT, Doppler, echo, especially for people who maybe don't have a neurologist readily available?
Yes, I think, I mean, the standard now is you definitely have to have some sort of brain imaging, so CT's fine, and then you want to have some sort of neurovascular imaging. And 25% of strokes we now know are due to intracranial disease, and admittedly there's not anything we can do about it right now, but we probably should know that that's a factor. If they have an M1 stenosis, in the future we may have stents and things like that that we can safely put in there to try to treat that.
I just want to make a pitch for the most common cause of stroke, which is atrial fibrillation. The majority of hospitals in Canada don't even do 24-hour Holter monitoring. So you can extend to 48, you could do loop recorders for 4 weeks, you can do implantable reveals. And there's actually an ongoing randomized study looking at just putting everybody with a stroke on a NOAC, with presumed embolic stroke on a NOAC versus placebo. Okay,
right, we could talk for hours about that.
So we're going to move on now. Our next speaker, thank you, Brian. Do I have to say Subhas, or can I say Subi? Subi Gupta. He is a professor and chairman of plastic surgery and chief of surgical services at Loma Linda University, and the vice president of medical affairs. Sorry, that's removed, sorry. No disclosures related to that. Subi is a pioneering plastic and reconstructive surgeon. Educator and researcher with particular interest in complex reconstruction, skin substitutes, wound healing, and microsurgery. He also holds a PhD in medical informatics with expertise, that's based on the West Coast, with expertise in active research projects in patient safety, wound healing, scar control, advanced technologies in wound care, nutrition, surgery, technology assessment. Published over, and also healthcare economics, published over 80 scientific articles and serves on several scientific review and editorial boards. Welcome back.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. And I need a copy of that for my website. That would be great. Thanks. As everyone else has noted, it is really a privilege and an honor to be back and to be on this side of the podium after so many years. I'm very excited to speak to you all today. It seems like I was the only one that played by the rules and put the official disclosure slide up. I have federal government research funding, and I'm an employee of our university's faculty medical group, neither of which I think bias my presentation today. As Lawrence mentioned, I live and work in Southern California at Loma Linda University. We're located in the inland region of Southern California, and we provide service to a general population area of about 4 million or about 4.1 million people as a level 1 trauma center for both adult and pediatric care. We're a fairly large healthcare system with about 5,000 healthcare only students, about 1,000 physicians, and we handle about 2.4 million patient visits on an annual basis through our healthcare system. My job there for the past 17 years or so has been exclusively to work on restoring form and function of the complex patients that come in through our emergency room, through our clinic setting, and really working on them. We have a common type of injury that we see called the Saturday night special, which are, of course, all the people that go out driving in the desert near where we live in their souped-up dune buggies called rhinos, and we see rhino rollovers on a very regular basis. Essentially every weekend I'm on call. And they come in with very extensive damage to their upper extremity. We timed this talk to be just before the lunch break. Thank you very much. And these are great cases that we really enjoy taking care of because there's a lot of complexity to what we have to do. There's open fractures, devascularizing injuries where we have to restore blood flow, clean up the skin, do lots of work, and then we have to reconstruct them. And my interest in regenerative medicine actually started much to the chagrin of the people who trained me, because rather than using standard methods, when it's 2:30 in the morning and you want to finish a case, you come up with alternative pathways. So we've done a lot of things over the years that we'll talk about in a few minutes that have really changed the way we reconstruct these wounds to achieve much better outcomes at something that matters a lot to everyone in this room, whether you're in Canada or the US, much lower cost as well. So again, with a goal of restoring form and function to my patients. We've had a tremendous desire to improve care and outcomes across the plastic surgery realm. In 1984, anyone who's trained in plastic surgery since 1984 was trained in what we call the reconstructive ladder, which is a very simple scenario in which we address the different methodologies through which we can close a defect, and we dial the patient up or down this ladder to come up with the right strategy. A lot has changed to that ladder. We've added technology. We've added the ability to do microsurgery and transplant autologous tissue from point A to point B. But even further, we now have high-tech options, things such as negative pressure wound therapy, which is new since we were all students and residents, tissue expansion. We have directed cytokine therapy. There's actually allograft work being done that perhaps we'll hear some from Steve on in the next talk, where we're seeing hand transplants and face transplants play a role in this. And then, of course, there's regenerative medicine, regenerative technologies, and that's going to be my focus today. Unlike perhaps some of the other speakers, rather than using my classmates as an audience for a talk I'm experienced in giving, I'm actually giving this talk for the first time to you. I figured it would be friendly fire. Harold, that's true, isn't it? Yeah, good. So regenerative medicine is a series of therapies that are used to regenerate, rebuild damaged and diseased cells. And it's really designed to replace and restore tissues that are missing. The tools used are primarily based out of the tissue engineering realm, and we look at stem cells. So Brian, thanks for the setup. It's going to go great. Natural and synthetic skin folds, for which we call on our biomedical engineering and true engineering colleagues, as well as 3D printing and ultimately chip technologies that we'll talk about briefly. So it's a very highly interdisciplinary field. The beginning of regenerative medicine, in my mind, and at least in its current form, really came in the late 1990s when the Vacanti brothers and Robert Langer built the ear, and this was the cover of Time magazine. Many of you probably saw this. They built the human ear on the back of a mouse, and this was a construct of a human tissue seeded with chondrocytes that was cultivated on the back of the immunosuppressed nude mouse. Since that time, a lot of other things have been grown, and some of which have actually been placed into the body successfully. We're seeing artificial organs, predominantly a bladder, which was a composite of muscle and fascia that has actually been implanted successfully, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And there's also been a variety of materials that have been built and now implanted successfully, including allograft cartilage seeded with autologous tissue for tracheal reconstruction, and a variety of allograft-based dermal matrices that are used for both restoration of tissue, suspension of things like the bladder. They're used extensively in the orthopedic realm for tendon reconstruction and reinforcement as well. The biggest areas of regenerative medicine, though, have been in cellular therapies, and as Brian just mentioned in his talk, the use of mesenchymal stem cells. I think in his talk he was primarily talking about allograft-based stuff, but of course autologous as well, have really been used to enhance regeneration, and not only of the brain, but we're seeing this in the beta cells of the pancreas, done in several trials in South Korea. We're seeing cardiomyocytes being induced in Shanghai, China. We're seeing bone being studied in Germany and in Russia. And these are primarily based around, or the new work is primarily based around autologous tissue. And the clinical trials that are active in North America today are mostly around neurodegenerative conditions, as Brian mentioned, as well as several oncology indications as well. My interest in this is a little bit different from all of that. In 2012, some of you will know that the Nobel Prize in Medicine was given to two physicians, Dr. Gurdon and Dr. Yamanaka. And these guys, over the course of 30-odd years, beginning in the early 1960s, demonstrated that adult cells could have induced pluripotential. And that's really where my interest stems from, is as a plastic surgeon, one of the things that we often do is we remove tissue that we generally subsequently discard. But fat is the new gold for us, and you would have to have been living under a box to not be aware of all the things that people are trying to do with fat that we harvest now. It is a true reconstructive and regenerative tool. But fat by itself isn't great. It's just okay, and you get a little bit of it to take, perhaps 30 to 40% when we graft fat as a structural support, as a tissue graft. So we do physical processing of the fat, which is something that is allowed in the U.S. and does not require specific IRB or other clinical advisory assessment. We do mechanical separation with centrifugation. We get a traditional 3-layer separation of the fat, where the most superficial layer is the oil from ruptured adipocytes, and that kind of looks like oil. The middle layer are the healthy, intact adipocytes. And then you have the red heme layer, which is usually a combination of plasma, red blood cells, and the local anesthetic that you probably put into the patient to harvest this. But a little bit of closer attention, and you'll see what's indicated by my blue arrow here, which is this white layer at the base of the living adipocytes. And those are specifically the stromal vascular fraction, which are the part of the fat that is very rich in stem cells, or at least the mesenchymal adipocyte-derived stem cells. We started a trial on using liposuction-derived stem cells, specifically the stromal vascular fraction, for the reversal of radiation injury in our breast cancer patients. And with the primary outcomes being to induce cells that produced new blood vessels, true neovascularization, pulling from some of the work done in Southeast Asia around transmyocardial revascularization with stem cells. We had great success in reversing the radiation damage, both with unadulterated fat cells, but then also with those that we adjusted. We have since used the same stromal vascular fraction for facial rejuvenation in the form of fat grafting, with really surprisingly good and resilient results when it comes to regenerating tissue and reversing some of the effects of aging. Of course, much more popular than stromal vascular fraction, and perhaps easier and what requires a lot less technology, is platelet-rich plasma. Certainly many of you in this room have probably been involved and perhaps used platelet-rich plasma in your practices. It simply involves concentrating platelets from a patient's blood sample. There are, of course, cytokines and growth factors in the PRP. And depending on which study you read, the PRP can accomplish miracles. I was somewhat doubtful of PRP. I know my orthopedic colleagues in the room are probably ready to shoot me right now if it's something that they like to use. But we, in collaboration with our orthopedic colleagues, evaluated stromal vascular fraction and PRP in large joint arthritis. We isolated both of those materials and used ultrasound guidance. That's old school, I guess, Matt, huh? We used ultrasound guidance, the answer was not CT, to inject either or both PRP and SVF into large joints in patients that had hip or knee arthritis. We found very, very clearly that stromal vascular fraction alone or in combination with PRP produced a very significant delay in, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way, provided a significant extension to the time before these patients required total joint arthroplasty. And really it was about pain control and imaging. So we're pretty impressed with what we've been able to do with the stromal vascular fraction, especially in contrast to platelet-rich plasma. There's a variety of constructs that now people are working on as it relates to elements of tissue that we can easily remove. Epidermal stem cells have been removed for some time, and there are several commercial entities that produce skin, and this has primarily been used in burn patients, patients with toxic epidermal necrolysis syndrome. Then on the adipocyte-derived stem cells, in the US, in our lab, we are working on breast reconstruction in patients post-mastectomy using the stromal vascular fraction to repopulate a scaffold. These are not in human trials yet. Around the world, we see a lot of other applications being done for both fat cells, but other forms of autologous mesenchymal stem cells. Again, much as Brian mentioned, these are being drilled into craniotomy, partial thickness craniotomy sites. They are being fired into the heart wall using CO2 laser in patients. You can almost pick the failing organ and you'll find that somewhere in the world somebody is trying to shoot autologous stem cells into it. The primary protocols that have had the greatest success and that are all in clinical trials in the surgical realm now are based around a scaffold that is seeded with material. And these scaffolds are generally made of hydrogels. Sometimes there's a bioabsorbable component to them. And then as a secondary procedure, this porous construct has stem cells added to it. Then the seeded scaffold is incubated and then transplanted into an animal model. There have been some human studies done, just not in North America. Perhaps one of the greatest successes that has recently happened came from a combination team from South Korea and Wake Forest University in the US, where a patient with a very significant defect of the mandible underwent what at the time was the first successful 3D printed regenerative construct. And to take you through this fairly briefly, the defect was modeled in 3 dimensions. The 3D printer was set, and this used a very specific printer, which the Wake Forest guys call the 3D organ tissue printer, and there's no acronym for that I know of. Lawrence, maybe there'd be one in French you could come up with. Those are good ones. So this 3D printer prints out a construct of the hydrogel on an absorbable biopolymer that leaves a very porous surface structure, and that's built into the printing system. And then as a final layer, there is a frosting done, if you will, of the surface of the construct with differentiated autologous stem cells. In this case, osteoblasts were used. And there was a completely successful reconstruction of this patient's mandible. The results published were at 2 years post-implantation of this. And this is very impressive technology because it was a composite print. There was no bioreactor. There was no placement of the initial 3D construct into either an animal or a bioreactor or even buried in the patient's abdominal wall before transplant, or before implant into the patient. So it's a true step forward. And for that, most of the credit goes to Dr. Atala from Wake Forest. He's also the first person to have printed what was a single layered construct, which was the muscle fascia of a human bladder. His current work is in a slightly different realm where he is working on hepatocytes, nephrons, and a few other cell types for pharmacologic testing as well. And these will be autologous constructs to determine sensitivity of drugs in a very precise, personalized way. I think that was the word you put in the title, Harold. Next pioneer I'll briefly mention is Dr. Macchiarini. He implanted the world's first donor trachea, but as it turns out, he lied. So we're going to remove him from history. His patient actually did not do well, though there were 4 or 5 years of fame and multiple jobs that he got. Jordan Miller is down in Rice University, and he's working on using simple carbohydrates to create blood vessels that have been implanted into patients. The potential around this chip technology work that Dr. Atala and others are working on is tremendous. Using this for true, precise medicine is probably the future. Fortunately, they're always going to need the plastic surgeons to harvest the autologous tissue. So even if you can rebuild it without us, you still need us to get it started. There are challenges. The one challenge that had previously really been #1 on my list in this is #3, which is how do we put in this construct and have it revascularize? I think we're seeing with the paper from Kang and others that some of this has been well addressed. So we do start to approach a very Blade Runner type environment where there's going to be libraries of parts that you can easily seed with your own autologous tissues. Now, when I say soon, of course, I'm talking about 20 to 30 years from now. And that'll lead to these very bionic body parts. Regenerative medicine and healthcare is something that's rapidly evolving, rapidly growing. There have been a lot of stem cell transplants worldwide. Cell therapies created over almost $1 billion in revenue in the US. As a plastic surgeon, there's a lot of tissue structures that are going to be built this way. A lot of the things that we currently reconstruct in the extremities, in the head and neck, following skin cancer defects, breast reconstruction, as well as reconstructing lower extremity trauma, we're going to start to have composite rebuilds. I'll finish with a case that's a case of mine that really, for me, hammered home how we do or why we should do regenerative medicine. This is a young boy who, as the story goes, was playing in his backyard and was attacked by a neighbor's dog and lost a lot of his tissue. I was called by my residents on a Sunday afternoon and say, we were setting up patient X for a free flap tomorrow because he's missing everything. I said, sure, that's fine. We got to the OR, and unfortunately he was sick. He had had a cold, which probably was a pneumonia by the time we saw him, and we were limited by our anesthesiologist in terms of what would be safe to subject him to. We used some initial biologic skin substitutes. Then we used some seeded biologic skin substitutes, but this was as part of a IRB sanctioned trial. We're able to reconstruct a lot of the missing tissues to really produce a very satisfying reconstruction, which is way better than what we could have done in the past, way better than if I had thrown a free flap up there. Even with multiple reconstructions, we could never achieve that level of aesthetic value. This boy happens to be a pediatrician now, actually. He's all grown up, and I actually get to see him fairly regularly. So regenerative medicine is the future. It's definitely what I'm going to be involved with. Thank you all very much.
I'm sure there are no questions.
Yeah, nothing controversial.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Something really common like breast cancer and the tremendous work you're doing in reconstruction, are you seeing people opting more for mastectomies or double mastectomies and reconstruction versus the damage you showed from radiation therapy?
Yes to all of the above in those questions. Numerous studies have recently been published around the increasing rate of bilateral mastectomy, including, of course, the contralateral prophylactic mastectomy in women. Many people call this the Angelina Jolie effect after her very public presentation of this. But yes, we are seeing a very sharply increasing number of bilateral mastectomy patients for reconstruction.
Do you find you're getting better results than you would if they had done the radiation followed by any kind of improvement?
As a scientist, I'm going to say I don't know yet, but certainly anecdotally, yeah, of course. But that's actively being studied.
Thanks so much. Great innovation. For something maybe simple tissue like subcutaneous tissue. In 2017, are we at the point now where if I said, geez, I need some subcutaneous tissue for this patient because their subcutaneous tissue just isn't working, could that be ordered now, or are we still years away from something like practically getting something like that in a simple commercial way?
So sub-Q tissue specifically, which is a padding tissue, we're not that far away from that. Yeah.
It's still not quite there. Like
Yeah,
Monday morning.
not quite there, but we are doing a lot of elective fat grafting, not the stromal vascular fraction transfer specifically, but a lot of elective fat grafting is being done.
Thanks, Sumi.
Great, thanks.
We're just setting up the last speaker, which Harold's going to introduce.
So thank you for being patient. We're running a little bit late, but we've saved a very good talk from Steve, who we think it's a good talk because he's the only one that didn't submit it in advance, and of course submitted it in an alternate format so that we have to set up his computer. But Steve also graduated with us in '92, did PhD work on the human pancreatic beta cells, and went to the University of Minnesota in 2000, where he trained with the islet transplant pioneer David Sutherland. He returned to McGill in 2002 and has been here since then. He's currently an associated professor of surgery, director of the pancreatic and islet transplant program, and director of the human islet transplantation laboratory. Steve obviously is involved in a lot of things, helped with some of the planning for the weekend as well. But he's president of the Canadian Society of Transplantation and served as an advisor to the Canadian Blood Services as well as the American Society of Transplant Surgeons, serving as co-chair of the Executive Planning Committee for their meeting in 2011. He's also on several editorial boards. Your computer's still not detected, but you're going to come up and I think you have to turn it on for it to be detected.
And I'll mention him. Let me just plug this back in. Oops. Thank you. I'm sorry. I haven't really changed that much in 25 years. I still do my presentations at the last minute, so I was throwing this together this morning. Is there another way to do presentations? Okay. And I'm going to take a second to echo everybody else, and that was amazing, Subi and all of you. It was amazing talks, and this is by far, the best session and the presentation I'm most honored to give. So I'm really touched to be here. I only have 20 minutes, so I will keep the reflections to a minimum. So my talk is about the past, present, and a little bit of the future of emerging therapies for type 1 diabetes. And I'm going to wave a lot at people that I see because I just walked in a few minutes ago before we finished our coffee break. I didn't get the official disclosure slide, but I have a research grant from a pharmaceutical company that makes immunosuppressive agents, but it really doesn't pertain to the aspects of this presentation I'm going to talk to you about. And here's some food for thought for a second. About a third of individuals with type 1 diabetes have impaired awareness of hypoglycemia. And maybe a little bit more than half of these suffer severe hypoglycemic events. About 50% of those people fail to manage and continue to have severe hypoglycemias despite any modality. So they're the ones that take sensors, use pumps and all that, and they still, despite that, still have very hyperlabile glycemic control. So we're down to about 10% of type 1 diabetics. So about 5% of type 1 diabetic patients account for about 50% of all severe hypoglycemic events. And also, that same 5% accounts for about 70 to 80% of the cost to the system of the disease. So while what I'm about to show you may not be ready for prime time for every diabetic, we certainly can make a significant impact on the cost of diabetes to our health system, and maybe offer a look at a future in which diabetics will be treated much more widely. So this is a cover from a recent American Journal of Transplantation issue, which sort of puts a little different spin on something that's been called the beta cell sweepstakes, or a variety of different idioms that have been used to describe it. And it kind of looks like here's three players at a poker table, and who's got the best hand? Well, the poor guy on the right, the whole organ pancreas transplant, I think I can read that face, and he's not looking too happy with the cards he's been dealt. The islets are they're a little hard to read, and then there's the fellow in the back who I can't read at all, and those are the technological solutions that are advancing very rapidly as well. But I think it's safe to say that, that this operation, whole organ pancreas transplantation, is headed in the next 10 years for some sort of retirement. We still perform it. It's still performed around the world, of course. Many thousands of people have benefited from it. But, and we've learned a great deal, but I think it is heading for retirement. One of the things we've learned is that successful stabilization, normalization of glycemic excursions have the following very beneficial effects. On native kidney nephropathy, you see a resolution of glomerular disease. On the retina, we see a stabilization and even resolution or regression of retinopathy with many years of normal glycemia, and autonomic neuropathy as well. Caught at the right stage, most of what we consider to be end organ damage appears to be reversible to a certain degree. Again, caught at the right stage. And of course, this has obvious connections with mortality and survival. So here's relative risk of mortality in pancreas transplantation versus standard therapy. Of course, this depends on the selection of your population. These were generally people with end-stage renal disease whose long-term survival is dismal. And once they've been transplanted, obviously see a very, very significant improvement in long-term survival. And it was to the point where even the American Diabetes Association in the year 2000 noted in this position statement that pancreas transplantation should be considered an acceptable therapeutic alternative to insulin therapy when you need a kidney. And in the absence of indications for a kidney transplant, that it can be considered when people have frequent, acute, and severe metabolic complications, et cetera. So that was quite a bold statement for an operation with a significant risk and risk of complications. So it was quite a bold statement from the ADA. Fast forward about 15 years, however, and the picture is a little bit different for the whole organ option. Here's a survey from our international society asking why global transplant rates are in decline for the last few years, and even the American contingent who've had the greatest experience noting in editorials an alarming crisis in confidence. Not only a crisis in confidence, I think, from the transplant community, but from diabetics, patient communities, and referral communities as well. So why is that crisis in confidence? I think it's because of the gain in popularity for this option. And this is how we do an islet allograft. It starts with the pancreas donor, a multi-organ donor usually, very similar to the types of situations where we get hearts and lungs and livers and kidneys. But instead of taking the pancreas to the operating room, we take it to a special laboratory where it's infused with a very expensive solution of collagenases. And under very controlled conditions in a sterile chamber and circuit, we heat it up to 37 degrees. And for a few minutes, you get a complete dissociation of the pancreatic tissue, which we can then, if you time it right, dissociate the acinar cells from the islets, which emerge intact. And as again, if you time it right, the islets are not themselves dispersed into single cells. And then we can purify these on a machine known as the COBE 2991 cell processor, which was developed for blood separation. And there you get essentially the differentiation on the basis of density between the exocrine compartment, which is 99% of the pancreas volume, and the endocrine compartment, which is about a few cc's of tissue. We're able to culture that. We're able to evaluate it in a number of ways. And we're able then to to even transport it long distances to a recipient, where a skilled radiologist, not with CT actually, a skilled radiologist or a surgical approach to the portal venous circulation, we infuse it into the liver. And the liver here forms our sort of surrogate graft site because of the inability to really embolize tissue safely into arterial beds, which cause too many strokes and other things. And so the liver serves as an acceptable, if imperfect, graft site for this tissue, and then becomes kind of a hybrid organ producing insulin. Prior to 2000, many of the attempts at doing this really resulted in anecdotal levels of success. And most of you, at least in Canada, will remember that in 2000, the group in Edmonton, with a very, very experienced and capable lab, were able to show in 7 consecutive patients 100% diabetes reversal in the first year, following up to 3 infusions of islets. And this caused quite a sensation and notoriety and fame for the Edmonton group. A few years later, the international community attempted to reproduce the Edmonton results. And while the results weren't bad, they weren't exactly as rosy as the original Edmonton report had noted. Of course, they still managed to get a New England Journal paper out of it, so I think it's pretty good when you fail and you get a New England Journal paper out of your failure. It's not exactly a failure, but as you can see, not quite 100%, maybe 60% of patients get completely insulin independent, and of those, the insulin independence is transient, lasting maybe a couple of years in the best of cases. Why is this? Probably because we have a number of toxic factors that are acting on the islets, and in particular, obviously the autoimmune autoreactivity of these type 1 diabetics, alloimmune processes that are present in every transplant. We've got thromboinflammatory events when they get infused into the liver that we've got to control. There's the toxicity associated with high blood sugars in cells that are still trying to recover, as well as drug toxicity from immunosuppression. So a number of these issues are being addressed, have been addressed, and we think we're making progress. Recurrent autoimmunity and alloimmunity is obviously a big problem, and it's interesting in this series of Italian patients that 39 out of 70 of them developed increasing levels of autoantibodies after transplantation. So that autoantibody levels had regressed over the years, and there was evidence of stimulation of autoimmunity post-transplant, as well as, in the big green circle there, alloimmunity, so anti-HLA immunity, which was detected. And these were the patients invariably who did worse. So if you see the autoantibody increase or alloimmune increase patients in the dashed and gray lines were the ones who experienced only a year or two of stability, whereas the people who didn't develop either evidence of alloimmunity or worsening autoantibody levels had actually stable function for a number of years. And this is what we've seen with a number of single-center experiences in the last few years with advances in immunosuppression, and now multiple sites reporting stable insulin independence of 50, 60, 70% over the course of 5, 6, 7 years. And we think that's reached the threshold where we're really excited about this becoming a standard approach. In about 2006-07, the Food and Drug Administration commissioned sort of the Hall of Famers, or the who's who in the U.S., to do a very careful and rigorous trial to determine if the FDA could subsequently license islets as a product. Of course, it's a processed cell product, similar to the adipose-derived stem cells. Included in this trial was Edmonton and a few Scandinavian centers. And their first report came out last year, and of course it's very encouraging because basically 87% of subjects achieved the primary endpoint, which was normalization of hemoglobin A1C and protection from severe hypoglycemic events. That's not insulin independence, of course. That was shown here, and they still managed to achieve insulin independence in slightly over a half. They lost a lot of subjects to follow-up because the data requirements were just so onerous that they noted that, you know, of the subjects that made it past a year, they lost another 28 subjects to follow up who just couldn't keep up with the data requirements. So they believe that the actual insulin independence rate at 2 years is about 42%. So this is greeted by a great amount of fanfare from the transplant community, proclaiming at last that after decades in the wilderness, islet transplantation is coming of age. And here's a single center experience from San Francisco showing basically equivalence of long-term outcomes between whole organ and cell transplantation. This is the first report of equivalence between the two options, and they even did a little cost analysis and showed that while we're shifting costs from the operating room to radiology and the islet processing lab, we're not talking about a treatment that's excessively, it's essentially equivalent in terms of costs. And that's a number of centers, including our own, have done cost analyses in the Canadian context, and it's about the same. If I have a couple of minutes left, I'm just going to take you on a personal tour of the MUHC lab and transplant program. And I don't know if anyone else is lucky enough to be able to trace their career decision to to reading a single article, but this was mine. Coincidentally, in the year that we graduated, I read this paper in the New England Journal, and I think it was part of the decision to pursue this career. Sometimes once or twice I've wanted to go and find it and burn it, but mostly not. A few years after my return to McGill, we were lucky enough to have a $2 million funding decision from the Canada Foundation for Innovation, which my predecessor, Laurie Rosenberg, was able to secure in order to build basically what amounts to a lab within a lab. And this blueprint here, which we looked at for several years, shows you that this is a clean room within an area that is basically designed to support it. I don't know if I have a pointer here. Or maybe not. Hey? Okay. So this is where we do most of our work. And this is the sort of support area. We have our own sterilization, washing, water purification. We've got a little office, a testing lab for islet evaluation. But everything, all the business goes on in here. And this room has to conform to certain industry requirements, which are known as good manufacturing practices. And Health Canada visits us from time to time to make sure that we respect those regulations. Basically, that room is about 10 times cleaner than an operating room. And as I used to tell people when we were at the old Royal Victoria Hospital, it's about 100 times cleaner than the operating rooms at the Royal Victoria Hospital. Anyway, we finally went from 2 dimensions to 3 in 2008. And again, it took us a couple of years to secure funding and such for technical compliance for personnel. We had to find people trained to do this with me. I certainly couldn't do it by myself. And very lucky now to be able to take potential benefactors and donors on a tour of the place, sometimes when it's actually functioning. So here we are preparing the lab for receipt of a pancreas. And the first thing we do is trim the gland of extraneous vascular fatty tissue in the duodenum and the spleen and all the things that people send it to us with. And this is done on a special tray that is cooled so that we don't acquire a lot of warm ischemia. Excuse me, I've had a bit of a cold in the last couple of weeks. So this is about $5,000 worth of enzyme. So the staff are instructed to carry it around the lab with two hands. And that's one dose for one pancreas. Here's our $5,000 of enzyme going into the pancreas after everything has been removed, all the other tissue has been removed from it. And this is done under sort of controlled conditions. Then it goes into this Ricordi chamber, as it's known, as the Ricordi circuit, which is our sterile dissociation circuit. And then we get this, which we're able to monitor in the few minutes of 37-degree dissociation. The orange here is the acinar tissue, and the dithazone is staining the islets in dark red. And part of working in GMP conditions is not just the actual environmental conditions, but the documentation. So we have approximately 250 active SOPs that we've got to keep updated and revised. And so there's always a book of SOPs lying around wherever we are. We feel a little bit like pilots, as we have to recite protocols to each other that we've done many times. But that's what we're required to do. And so here's actually our former manager, Craig, setting up the 2991 cell processor for purification. And here we are evaluating the preparation and storing images on our server at the end of about 8 to 12 hour islet processing. And this is what you get at the end of it. These are transplant-ready islets. So after a couple of years of trying to work with the institution, and they required us to go through an economic assessment of the technology in the lab and how much it was going to cost. They're very supportive. They just wanted to make sure that it fit the budget. As well as a couple of years of working with the OPO to develop a new list of recipients and allocation principles. Finally, all the stars aligned on May 23rd, 2015, just short of 10 years after we got the funding to build the lab. This is the team who basically worked together trained together for a good 5 years for this with their first clinical graft. And here we are in CT. Oh, it's not CT, sorry. Here we are in Dave's neck of the woods under fluoroscopy, accessing the portal vein. That's our chief of radiology, Benoit Galix, who actually performed this procedure in France many times before he came to McGill. And hooking up the graft, it's a little bit different than I'm used to seeing grafts being hooked up, but it's also a lot of fun. This is our first individual. She's a physician, actually, who couldn't leave the house without family members and couldn't really sleep through a night without having to check her sugars for many years. Had pancreas transplant about 5-6 years ago, and it failed within the first 48 hours. And so here her sugars are in green over the first month post-transplant, and we artificially just reduced her insulin doses as she went along, and as long as her sugars were normal. And since July 7th, 2015, now 2.5 years, she hasn't taken a single unit of insulin. So we're very encouraged, and the patients that have followed her have also experienced similar levels of success. We're still actually waiting for government approval to make this a supported therapy in Quebec. So currently we have to raise funds in order to do a transplant, but the hospital's been good about sort of reimbursing us for some of our expenses and shoveling it all under the global budget. But in order to expand, for sure, we will need a decision from our government officials. But so what happens in the future? I think I'm out of time. I'll just spend a couple of minutes here. Obviously, if we want to treat more than just the sickest individuals, we're going to have a bit of a source problem. And so here's the generation of functional pancreatic beta cells in vitro. This is from Doug Melton at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. He's probably the global leader in this type of process. And Doug was here delivering rounds in May, and he admitted that about 35% to 40% of these cells have no definable phenotype. So that's just a little bit of a problem when we have to consider putting them into someone. They're good in vitro, but he admits that we're still a few years away from being able to reliably and safely give them to people. And I'm concluding, actually, Harold, I'm sorry. if we look at what's needed for cells to survive, we obviously have the challenges of immunity, two types of immunity. The good things don't change. There's immunity, there's anoxia. Anoxia causes fibrosis, and so does immunity. These three processes are going to act on whatever we put into people, whether it's autologously derived or not. And then there's the cells themselves. They have to function, and they have to be safe. And so these are the challenges that we see ahead. Now, the Melton group recently took another step in a positive direction by encapsulating these stem cell-derived beta cells. And they work in mice, but again, they will have to be in some way retrievable in case there's a safety issue. So retrievability is answered partly by devices such as this, which is in clinical trials right now, which combines a stem cell-derived beta cell product with a macro-encapsulated device that keeps them there. And is retrievable if we like. The problem is, of course, diffusion of nutrients and oxygen across that barrier and diffusion of insulin backwards. And whether a fibrotic reaction around this is going to limit its functionality. So I'll finish off by asking, what does all this teach us about a potential cure? And I tell all of my patients that this is not a cure, this is a therapy, and it's a therapy because we're trading off one set of risks and benefits for another, and we think it's a pretty good set of risks and benefits, but it is not a cure. What I tell potential donors is that if the other side of the river is the cure, we have to make sure that we spend enough time getting to the right stepping stones, and if we don't invest in the stepping stones, getting to the other side of the river is going to be a lot harder. So one of the immunological lessons that we've learned and some of the major centers have learned from islet transplant recipients is now being applied into trials such as this, which we're lucky enough to be partnering with Miami, the originators of this trial, which aims at reversing and sort of rejigging and rebooting autoimmunity in people who have recently diagnosed type 1 diabetes and still have C-peptide positivity, so they still have preserved beta cell mass. And if we can get enough funding for this trial, we're hoping to see if we can prolong the sort of honeymoon phase or even prolong that residual beta cell mass survival. And this is the sort of thing that keeps us going and makes us realize that allo transplantation of islets is the next big stepping stone to something even more exciting. So that's about it. The take-home messages are that pancreas transplantation has proven that good glycemic control really does benefit end organ damage, and end organ damage sometimes is not as permanent or irreversible as we think. That islets now offer similar outcomes and excellent A1C normalization, protection from hypoglycemia at similar costs and far fewer technical complications, so they're a very attractive package. And in particular, in the context of those with impaired awareness of hypoglycemia and severe events, islets are very protective. Stem cell-derived or engineered beta cells are probably the next iteration and have shown stability and function in experimental models, and their acceptance is going to depend on safety parameters and retrievability. But the immunoisolation devices and technology that we'll need to ensure that they don't get destroyed are obviously something that still does not exist in a perfect form. Here's our great team, which I could not say enough good things about. They're very, very dedicated. They're on call 24/7 for this. In particular, we've got a great clinical program of nurses, endocrinologists, radiologists, and Dave, are you there? Oh God, I've got to put you in there. Let me edit this slide. And that's about it. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay. We're going to have time for a few questions. It's an impossible task to give these people 20 minutes, and I really want to thank the speakers for having respected it, because we pushed to get an extra speaker in. They said, don't do this many, and we did it anyways. And thank you for your patience here. I know Lawrence has a comment, and if there's any other comments, we're sort of off.
Actually, I have two comments now. The first one is to Steve. Please exert caution when opening the pancreas, as islets may have shifted during flight. Just a final comment about the entire symposium before we take a question for Steve, because I don't want people to run out and leave. For anybody who was wondering where the title of the symposium came from, Repairing the World, it's from a Jewish philosophical statement of something called Tikkun Olam, which literally means repairing the world, and the whole concept of leaving the world a better place than when you came in. And I think you can see from all the speakers who presented today, whether it's changing an entire country's healthcare system, to just sitting in front of a patient, giving them a one-on-one attention, making them feel like a human being. I think the class of '92 has really been fantastic and outstanding in advancing this mission. Question?
Hi, there are other people who lose their pancreas. They have total pancreatectomies for IPMN. They don't actually have invasive disease. And they are diabetics and basically they have no acinar tissue. So it would be good if you could develop acinar tissue as well. And there's a differential in islets between the head and the tail.
Exactly. So in your first comment, yeah, we've got two of those on our list right now, on our waiting list, who are particularly brittle diabetics, having lost the counter-regulatory effect of glucagon as well with the total pancreatectomy. One interesting thing that the center in Milan is very experienced for several decades, just like Edmonton, is that they have actually had a very good series of auto islet infusions. So I guess they select the people who are less likely to have to be harboring a malignancy, and purify the islets from the pancreatectomy specimen and give them back. And so these people not being type 1s, essentially a good half to 75% of them will have normal control after something like this. And as long as we're not purifying and reinfusing cancer cells, that's obviously the concern, this seems to be a very attractive option for IPMN. The second part of your question is absolutely right. So it's well known that in the islet field that the beta cells are concentrated in the tail. We don't know why that is, but the islets in the tail are more beta cell heavy.
Thanks, Steve, for an excellent presentation. Fascinating. I have a question for you just with regards to the outcomes we were talking about. I wonder, because as a family physician, a lot of the emphasis in 2015, 2016, 17 has been on cardiovascular risk reduction in managing our diabetic patients, type 1 or type 2. And in those patients who do achieve insulin independence with islet cell transplants, has it been studied, or do we know yet if that translates into better vascular outcomes?
Yeah, there's been, in addition to the end organ studies, there's been a lot of cardiovascular studies with islets, a couple, with pancreas, a few more, because there are many more thousand patients with pancreas transplants, and the experience is longer. And it does follow, it mimics the mortality data, that we seem to have a stabilizing and potentially somewhat reversing effect on a variety of cardiovascular indices, and there are different studies looking at either biomarkers or radiologic studies and stuff like that.
Do you have any comment about the status of turning alpha cells into beta cells? And do you have any opinion about when smart insulin will be available that might help prevent those hypoglycemic?
So those are great questions. Yeah, there's some evidence that suggests, again, it's a little bit hard to deduce always from mice, but that beta cell differentiation goes via an alpha cell phenotype at first, and it's not really clear if that's real or not. But there are a number of very prominent stem cell labs, not just the one at Harvard, that claim they can now, they're very satisfied with their ability to take iPSCs and turn them into glucose responsive beta cells, because you don't want willy-nilly insulin secretion. Your second question, the islet, of course, which I guess is sort of like an iPhone with glucagon and insulin, is a bihormonal pump system that is about to be released, I think next year. Next year, actually, a lot of interesting things are happening. So the FDA decision is expected, after which I think we're going to see a huge proliferation of islet centers once a favorable decision is anticipated. France is also already arriving at the same conclusion, and a few other countries are already doing it. But the islet is coming out next year or 2019. Apparently, it's going to cost about $25,000 to $30,000 US. And if our experience with the pump is any indication, it's great, but it will be years, and some people will have no access to it. In public systems like ours, we still run into people all the time who have to apply to qualify to get reimbursed for their pump. And for most patients, it's just out of their reach. So I'm not sure how the islet is going to be sold. Obviously, if you can afford it, it'll be great.
I think that concludes the symposium. I'd like to invite all the speakers to come down. They want to take a few pictures. I'd like to remind everybody to fill out your evaluations. That's super important to be able to continue the accreditation procedures. Hope to see you tonight at the dinner.